It's quiet here tonight. The rain has been coming down since some time before supper, a soft, even rain, not the kind that rattles the windows or makes you worry about the gutters. Just steady and low, the way rain ought to sound when you're old enough to be grateful for it. I have the small lamp on by the armchair, the one with the amber shade that my daughter says makes the whole room look like an old photograph. Maybe it does. I don't mind that. My name is Eleanor. I was born in 1931 in a farmhouse outside of Millbrook, Ohio, which is not a town many people have heard of, and that has always suited me fine. I have lived a long life. Long enough to have seen things come and go that I once thought were permanent, and to have watched things I was sure would vanish last well past their time. A long life teaches you something about permanence, and what it teaches you, mostly, is that you were wrong about it. I'm not going to tell you anything tonight that you need to remember. You don't have to follow along carefully. You don't have to hold on to the names or the years or the order of things. This is not a test, and there is no one keeping score. I am just going to talk, the way an old woman talks when she has a quiet evening and someone willing to listen, and if you drift off somewhere in the middle of it, that is not only permitted but expected. That is, in fact, the whole idea. I've been thinking lately about the particular quality of evenings when I was very young. The way the darkness came in from the fields first, before it reached the house. You could be standing in the kitchen in full lamplight and still look out the window and see that the world beyond the glass had already turned to something else. Not threatening, just other. Like two different times of day existing at once, the warm indoors and the cool dark outside, and you lived in the thin seam between them. That is what tonight feels like to me sitting here, a seam. The lamp makes its little island of amber and everything beyond it is soft and indistinct, and I am content to stay here in the light and let the dark do what it likes. I thought I would start at the beginning, not the very beginning. There is only so much a person can tell you about being an infant, and most of it is not interesting to anyone, including the infant. But the beginning I remember. The house, the land, the smell of it in winter when the ground was frozen and the sky was the particular grey of old dishwater, and the whole world felt like it was holding very still, waiting for something. Come sit with me a while, dear. I have nowhere I need to be. The house was wood frame, white, 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full length of the front and sagged a little on the left side where the ground had settled. My father kept meaning to fix that sag. He never did. Not in all the years I was growing up there, and by the time I was old enough to ask about it, the sag had become so much a part of the porch that we had stopped seeing it. We just leaned slightly to the left when we sat out there, the way you adjust to things you cannot change and eventually cannot imagine without. There were 4 of us children. My brother Thomas, who was the eldest by 3 years, and who carried that distinction with great solemnity from the moment he understood what eldest meant. My sister Ruth, who was between us in age and who was, without question, the one the rest of us revolved around without quite knowing it. Then me, Eleanor, and then the baby, my brother James, who came along late and surprised everyone, including my parents. Or so I understood from certain looks that passed between the adults that I was too young to fully interpret but old enough to notice. We were a farm family in the way that people were farm families then, which is to say that the farm was not something separate from life. It was life itself, entire. Everything we did was organised around it, shaped by it, measured against it. The land itself was not what you would call beautiful, not the way calendar pictures are beautiful, not the way postcards are beautiful. It was flat mostly, the farmland of central Ohio being flat in the way that seems to go on past the horizon, past any individual's ability to see the end of it. There were some hills to the north that you could see on clear days, blue and low against the sky, and there was a creek at the back of our property that was sometimes full and sometimes only a trickle of itself, depending on the season and what the weather had or hadn't done. And there were the fields, which in summer were something green and tall and moving in the wind in a way that I still find settling to think about. That particular slow wave of a field of corn or wheat, like the land breathing, like something enormous breathing in and out in its sleep. But in winter the fields were something else entirely. In winter they were brown and bare and cold, the stubble of the last harvest left standing in rows, and the sky came down very low over them, and the horizon disappeared into grey, and the whole world was the colour of old paper. I loved it. I want to say that clearly and without equivocation because I think it is important, and because I have met people over the years who grew up in beautiful places, by mountains, on the coast, in places where the landscape offers itself to you like a gift on a daily basis, and I understand that kind of love for a place. But what I felt for that flat Ohio farmland was something different. It was not the love of beauty exactly. It was more like the love of a body for the particular chair it has always sat in. You don't love the chair because it is lovely. You love it because it is yours, because it fits you in all the places where you bend, because it smells like the years you have spent in it, because it is simply and irreducibly the chair, your chair, the one your life has the shape of. The smell of that land in winter. I keep coming back to that. It was cold and clean and slightly metallic, the way very cold air always is, with that brightness at the edges of it that makes you feel, when you breathe it in, that your lungs are being cleaned. And underneath that brightness there was the smell of the soil itself, which never entirely goes away even when it is frozen solid 6 inches down, a dark and mineral smell that is not unpleasant, but is very much of the earth, very much of the particular Ohio earth. And alongside that the smell of the dried cornstalks and the smell of the barn, which was distinct and real, and which I associated so completely with home that it was indistinguishable from the concept in my mind. In the mornings in January, when I came out of the house before school, that air hit you like something physical, like a flat cold hand, and you breathed in and your lungs felt enormous and bright, and you could see your breath hang in front of you in a little cloud, and for a moment you were very aware that you were alive in a way that the warm seasons did not quite make as plain. The kitchen was where we spent most of our indoor time. It was the warmest room, naturally, because of the woodstove, a big iron range that my mother treated with a combination of affection and severity, the way you treat a difficult but essential colleague who has proven themselves over many years. She was up before any of the rest of us every morning, and by the time I came downstairs the stove was already going, and there was the smell of coffee and sometimes biscuits or cornbread or oatmeal cooking, and the windows were fogged from the contrast between the cold outside and the warmth inside, and my mother would be standing at the stove in her house dress and her apron with her hair pinned up, and the whole scene had a kind of completeness to it, a kind of rightness, that I did not have the language for as a child, but that I understood in my body in the way that children understand the things that are most true. My mother's name was Vivian, and she was a small woman, fine-boned, with dark hair she wore pinned up in a style she had settled on sometime in her 20s, and saw no reason to abandon. She had a quality of efficiency that was not coldness. She was not a cold woman, but that you could mistake for coldness if you didn't know her well enough to see what was underneath it. She got things done. She got a great many things done every day without drawing particular attention to the fact that she was doing them, which is, I think, the most undervalued kind of competence there is. She baked bread on Mondays and Thursdays, without variation, without fail, so reliably that I still sometimes think, on a Monday, that I should be smelling bread. She kept a kitchen garden that in summer produced more tomatoes and green beans and cucumbers than we could possibly use, so she canned the rest, row after row of glass jars in the cellar, and in winter those jars were a kind of visible wealth, proof that summer had happened and could happen again. My father was a larger man, quieter than my mother, with big hands that were always slightly darker than the rest of him from the soil and the work. He was Leonard Schaefer, the son of August Schaefer, who had come over from Bavaria in 1892 and settled on this particular piece of Ohio, and the land had passed to my father the way such things passed, through death and necessity and the absence of alternatives. He was not a man who talked a great deal about what he was thinking or feeling, but he showed you what he cared about by the care he gave to things. He was meticulous with the animals. He was meticulous with the equipment. The barn was swept and ordered in a way that the house sometimes wasn't, because the barn was where he had full dominion and he knew it, and in his domain he maintained a standard that I would call, now, professional. When Thomas was old enough to work alongside him, my father taught him everything about the land and the animals and the equipment, without using very many words, which is how my father taught everything he knew. Thomas, my eldest brother, seemed to understand from a very young age that his future was here on this land. He followed my father around with a seriousness that I, as a younger child, found almost comical. This small boy performing the gravity of a grown man, asking about soil conditions and weather patterns and what the difference was between this variety of corn and that one, with an intensity that most boys his age reserve for fishing or baseball or the simple pleasures of small-town Ohio boyhood. Ruth, by contrast, was already somewhere else in her mind even when she was physically present at the kitchen table or in the garden. She was the one who brought home library books and kept them under her mattress, who saved her egg money to buy movie magazines that she read and traded with the girls at school, who talked about cities she had read about, Cleveland, Chicago, New York, with the confidence of someone who expected to visit them eventually, which was an expectation so foreign to the family's actual circumstances that I found it both admirable and slightly alarming. I was between the two of them in everything, in birth order and in temperament. I wanted to know what was right in front of me, the field, the barn, the kitchen, the particular quality of a November Tuesday afternoon with the light going flat over the stubble fields. But I also felt the pull of something larger, something I couldn't have named or located, but that arrived sometimes when I was listening to the radio or finishing a book and felt like a door ajar, letting in air from somewhere else. James was the youngest and the most cheerful of us, sunny in his disposition in a way that was its own kind of intelligence, the intelligence that finds things to be glad about in circumstances that do not obviously invite gladness. He was born in 1937 when I was 6, and I can still remember the afternoon he came home, the particular weight of him when my mother put him in my arms for the first time, heavier than I expected and very warm, and the way he looked at me with the unfocused blue seriousness of very new babies, and how I felt something then. Responsible was the word. I felt responsible in a way that I had not felt before, and that was not quite the same as what I felt about anyone else, that I have carried in modified forms ever since. Winters were long. I don't mean that as a complaint, they were simply long, the way Ohio winters are, grey and cold from November well into March, with enough snow most years to make everything quiet and softened and strange, and then patches of thaw and mud that were in some ways worse than the cold itself, and then more cold before it finally released its hold in April. We didn't go anywhere much in winter, not by today's standards. There was school, the 4-mile walk there and back along the county road, sometimes with Thomas when we overlapped in our school years, later with Ruth, later still alone. The cold so reliable and so daily that you stopped thinking about it as an event and started thinking about it as a condition, the way you think about the colour of the sky or the pull of the earth. You dressed for it and you walked, and when you arrived at school you stood near the stove with the other children and waited to feel your hands again. And there were the animals to tend regardless of weather, which is one of the lessons livestock teach you without being asked. The world does not stop because you are cold or tired or would rather be somewhere else. But the evenings in winter had their own particular quality that I treasure when I think about them now. After supper, after the dishes were done and the lamp was lit in the parlour, my father might read the farm paper or sit with the radio if there was something on he wanted to hear, and my mother would sew or mend. She was always mending. There was always something that needed mending with 4 children growing at the rate children grow. And Ruth and I would do our schoolwork at the kitchen table or read, and Thomas and James would play checkers or argue quietly about nothing of importance, while the wind pressed against the side of the house and the building made its small evening sounds, the creak and settle of a wood-frame house in cold weather, the particular sound of the kitchen stovepipe contracting as it cooled. Those evenings were so ordinary, so absolutely without distinction, that I have spent the better part of my life trying to describe them and always falling a little short. They were just what evenings were, and they were, and remain in memory, sufficient. I think about the house now, the way it stood at the edge of the yard, the way the elm tree in the front had one low branch that we used to climb and sit on, and look out at the road, with the gravity of children surveying their territory. The way the porch boards felt under bare feet in summer, warm from the sun and slightly rough. The particular sound the screen door made when it swung shut, a sound so specific and so tied to everything I was that I can still hear it if I let myself go quiet enough. That house is gone now, has been gone for decades, replaced by something newer and more practical, a ranch house with aluminum siding and a concrete driveway and no elm tree. But I have not forgotten a room of it. I have not forgotten the angle of the afternoon light across the kitchen floor in October, the way it came in through the west window at about 4 o'clock and lay in a long rectangle on the linoleum, and you could stand in it and be warm. I've not forgotten the upstairs hallway that smelled of cedar from the chest where the extra quilts were kept, or the weight of those quilts on a winter night, heavy and warm and full of the reassurance that you were not going anywhere and did not need to. That was the place I came from. That is where I started, in 1931, in that house on Route 12 outside of Millbrook, Ohio, in a family that was complete, in the way that families are complete when they are functioning, when everyone in them is doing what they are supposed to do, and the whole arrangement holds together, and no one has thought yet to question whether the arrangement could be other than it is. I did not know it was complete then. You never do. That is perhaps the one thing I would tell the girl I was if I could reach back across all these years and find her standing on the porch in January, watching her breath cloud in the cold air. I would tell her, this is a complete thing. You're inside something whole. Let yourself know that, even a little, even now. The seasons in that part of Ohio had their own complete personalities, and I understood them from a very young age the way you understand things that are the whole world and not just a part of it. Spring arrived slowly, and then all at once. The way it does, the mud first and then the first green things pushing up through it, the smell of wet earth and thawing things, the specific quality of April light that is entirely different from the winter light, higher and thinner but full of a promise that you recognize even as a small child because you have been waiting for it, without quite knowing you were waiting. The smell of a spring morning on that farm is still available to me now, still completely specific. Not a general spring smell, but that farm's spring, the particular combination of the fields and the creek and the barnyard and the air coming off the wood of the house, warm for the first time in months. Summer meant the garden, which was my mother's domain in the absolute sense. She kept it with an attention that I now understand as devotion, the kind of attention that is so consistent and so specific to its object that it becomes a form of love. She knew each row, what was in it, how it was doing, what it needed. She could look at a tomato plant and tell you whether it was satisfied or wanted something, the way you can tell those things about plants you have tended for years by something in the posture of it, the colour of the leaves, the way it is holding itself in the morning light. I worked the garden with her from the time I was old enough to be useful, which was probably 5 or 6, pulling weeds in the rows while she moved ahead of me, and the heat of a July morning in the garden, the smell of tomato leaves, which is a specific green smell that I cannot compare to anything else, and the warmth of the soil, and the sound of the creek just audible at the back of the property, is as real to me now as anything that happened last Tuesday. Fall was the busiest season on the farm, the harvest, the culmination of everything my father had spent the year working toward, and the energy of it was different from any other season's energy, focused and urgent and somehow festive, the way important work feels festive when it is going well, when the weather is cooperating and the crop is good and the machinery is not breaking down. Thomas was involved in the harvest from the time he was strong enough to be useful, and later Robert would be. But for Ruth and me and James, fall was mostly the canning season, the kitchen filling with steam and the smell of vinegar and hot sugar, and the particular smell of green beans being blanched and peaches being peeled, the jars lined up on every available surface waiting to be filled and sealed, the cellar shelves filling up through September and October in a way that felt, every year, like a form of insurance against everything the winter might do. Winter, I have already told you about somewhat, but let me tell you more, because winter was the season I think about most when I think about that childhood, the season that shaped me most deeply. Winter was the season of interior life. Everything contracted. The world got smaller and slower and quieter, and you were thrown back onto the house, the family, the small economy of warmth and light against the cold. The radio mattered more in winter. The books mattered more. The conversations at the kitchen table mattered more, became longer and more winding, because there was nothing else competing for the space they occupied. My father in winter was a different man than my father in summer, not in his character but in his pace. In summer he was in motion from before dawn until well after dark, driven by the work and the weather and the urgency of things that had to be done in a specific window or not done at all. In winter he slowed. He read the farm papers more carefully. He repaired things that had been waiting all year for the time to repair them. He made things sometimes, in the barn in the evenings, woodworking of a simple kind, a shelf, a stool, a toy for one of us children, and the sound of the plane and the saw coming from the barn on a winter evening, just audible through the cold, was one of the sounds I associated with being safe, being contained in something that was holding steady against the weather. My grandmother, my mother's mother, who we called Grandma Weiss and who lived in Millbrook proper, in a small house that smelled of furniture polish and dried flowers, would come for Christmas every year and stay for several days, and her visits changed the atmosphere of the house in the particular way that grandmothers change the atmosphere of houses. She brought a kind of historical depth to things. She told stories about her own childhood, which had been in a different country altogether, in a small village in Bavaria that she had left at 17, and that she talked about with a mixture of nostalgia and relief that I did not understand until I was much older. The feeling of a place that was home, and that was also the place you had to leave in order to become who you needed to become. She taught me to make her Stollen, the German Christmas bread with the marzipan inside, and that recipe, modified slightly and simplified somewhat by my mother and then by me, has been made in our family every December since 1937 or so, and I made it this past December, and Catherine will make it next December, and I do not know how many more Decembers it will travel. The neighbours, the community of the land around us, was a real community, in the way that rural communities were real communities then, which is to say that the people who lived within a mile or two of us were not strangers, but were, in the full sense, neighbours. People you helped and who helped you. People whose business was partially your business, because your survival was partially dependent on each other's. When my father's tractor broke down during the harvest of 1939 and there was a window of 3 days before the parts could arrive and the corn needed to come in now, 3 neighbouring farms sent their men and their equipment without being asked, and the corn came in and everyone went home for supper. This was not remarkable. This was what neighbours did, which is why the word meant something. I didn't understand then how unusual this was, or how it would change. I grew up assuming that the world was organised this way, that the human scale of things was naturally communal, that help arrived when it was needed because that was simply how it worked. The rest of my life has been, among other things, an education in how much that way of living depended on the specific conditions of that specific place and time, and how those conditions have changed and what has and hasn't replaced them. The neighbours I have in this town now are pleasant people. They wave when they see me. They call if something looks wrong at the house. But the deep mutual dependence of those farm families in Ohio in the 1930s, that is not the same thing. That was a different kind of community, and I'm glad I knew it, and I do not expect to see it again. There is a particular quality to memory that I want to describe before I go any further, a quality I've noticed over the years of being old enough to have a great many memories, and thinking about them carefully enough to observe how they work. They are not photographs. They are not recordings. They are something more like impressions, like the mark a warm hand leaves in cold wax. The shape of the thing rather than the thing itself, preserved in the emotional material of the moment rather than in objective fact. I cannot tell you whether my mother's kitchen table was 40 inches long or 48. I can tell you exactly the quality of light it held on a November afternoon, the particular yellow of it, warmer near the window and cooler toward the back of the room, and I can tell you how the room smelled, and the sound it held, and the feeling of sitting at it with my school things spread out in front of me and my mother in the kitchen behind me, making something that filled the house with the smell of it. That impression is more real to me than the measurements would be. It is more true, in the sense that truth is about what matters. My father's name was Leonard, which suited him, which was a name with weight to it, a name that implied a man who stayed in one place and held it. He was not tall, maybe 5'10" in his boots, but he had a solidity, a physical density, that made him seem larger than he was. He had the hands of a man who had done outdoor physical work since he was old enough to do it, which he had, which was since he was about 8 years old, working his own father's farm in the same county before the land passed to his older brother, and he had to find his own. He found it, with my mother's father's help, which was a story he told once, and that I gathered had involved a debt of gratitude that he spent the rest of his life paying in the form of loyalty to the Weiss family, which was my mother's family, though he never said it in those terms. My father rarely spoke about his own childhood. This was not unusual for men of his generation and background, men who had grown up poor and hard-working and without much occasion to introspect on their situation, did not, generally, narrate it to their children. What I know about his early years I know from my mother, who told me things in the years after he died, and from the way he carried himself, which was the way of a man who had not had much given to him, and who had decided early that this was not a grievance but simply the terms, and that the terms could be worked with. He was not bitter. I say that because bitterness would have been understandable, and was not uncommon in men of his era and experience. He was not bitter. He was practical and sometimes impatient, and occasionally stern in the way that a man is stern when the stakes feel high and the time feels short, but he was not bitter. And I have thought about this many times over the years, because I believe it was a choice, whatever else it was. The farm in winter was a different world from the farm in summer, different enough that it sometimes felt like two separate places that happened to occupy the same geography. In summer, the farm was abundant, noisy with the work of it, the machinery and the animals and the people moving across it, and the days were long and the light was everywhere, and the world felt not unlimited, but fully occupied, packed with the activity of growth and production. In winter, the farm contracted. The fields were bare, the equipment was sheltered, the animals were inside, and the days were short and the light was slanted and thin, and the world felt smaller, more interior, more concerned with what was inside the house and less with what was outside it. I preferred winter as a child, not for the cold, which was real and demanding, but for the interior quality of it, the way winter turned the household inward and made the evening lamp more important and the shared space of the kitchen more precious. I learned to read sitting next to my mother in that kitchen on the winter evenings. Not from a teacher. I could already read by the time I went to school, had been reading for a year or two by then, haltingly at first and then with increasing fluency as the words began to resolve from code into meaning, with the satisfying click of a combination lock opening. My mother read to me first, then read alongside me, then listened while I read to her, and then we read separately but in the same room, she with her Bible or her almanac or the occasional library book, me with whatever I had at the time, usually something from the small shelf in the sitting room or something borrowed from school. The reading was never discussed as a project or a goal. It simply happened, in the way that things happen when you're next to someone who's doing something, and you begin doing it too. The sitting room, the room we used on Sunday afternoons and on the special occasions when a room was wanted that was not the kitchen, had a particular smell that I've never found again in any other house. A combination of the old wood of the furniture and the particular cleaner my mother used on the floors and the faint dustiness of the curtains, and something underneath all of it that was simply the smell of the house itself, the accumulated presence of the people who had lived in it over the years, the smell that a place acquires when enough people have spent enough time in it. I loved that room in the way you love a room you're not in very often, the way scarcity creates a kind of reverence. On ordinary days it was the kitchen and the sleeping and the outdoors. On Sunday it was the sitting room, and the sitting room had a quality for those few hours of being a different kind of time. I was 2 years old when the Depression began, so I have no memory of a time before it. That is an important thing to understand about growing up the way I grew up, in the circumstances I grew up in. I did not experience the Depression as a fall from something better. I simply experienced it as the way things were, the only way things had ever been, the weather of the world I found myself in. We were not wealthy before October of 1929, and we were not wealthy after, and the particular variety of not wealthy that the Depression brought was something I had to learn about gradually, by watching my parents' faces and listening to the conversations they had when they thought we were asleep, and by noticing, as children always notice, the things that were absent. The things you notice by their absence have a particular weight. You learn the shape of something by the space it leaves. What was absent in our house was usually money in the direct and liquid sense. Not food. We had enough to eat, which I know now was not true of everyone, not even close to everyone, and I'm grateful for that in a way that only makes sense if you understand what the alternative looked like in those years, in the breadlines in the cities and the foreclosures in the countryside, and the families you read about in the newspaper who had nothing, not a thing, and nowhere to put nothing except the road. My father grew food. My mother preserved it. We had chickens for eggs and a cow for milk and a kitchen garden that my mother tended with the focused attention she gave to everything that mattered. We ate what we grew, and we grew what we could, and we were careful with what we had in a way that was simply normal to me. It was not sacrifice, not from where I stood as a child, because I had no other standard to measure it against. I knew we were not rich. I did not know we were poor. The distinction is not as simple as it sounds. but I understood that things were hard. You couldn't not understand, not with the radio bringing in the news from cities that seemed very far away but were not with my father's voice going quiet and strained when he talked to my mother about the price of corn, not with the neighbours who showed up sometimes at the back door, men I half recognised from church or from the feed store in town, men with their hats in their hands and something in their faces that I know now was humiliation, the particular humiliation of a man who has been providing for his family and no longer can, and my mother would always find something to give them, a loaf of bread, a jar from the cellar, sometimes a dozen eggs, something. And afterwards she would close the door and stand at the sink for a moment with her back to us, and I would not ask what she was thinking. I had some understanding, even at 7 and 8, that some things should not be asked about. The things we made do with. I have been turning that phrase over in my mind, making do, and how much life was contained in it, how much creativity and stubbornness and quiet dignity, how much ingenuity of the necessary kind. My mother made do in ways I did not fully appreciate until I was grown and had my own household and understood what it actually took to stretch things, to use things up completely, to waste nothing because nothing could be wasted, to find what was still left in something after you thought it was finished. Flour sacks became dish towels, and the better ones, the ones with the prettier prints, became blouses for Ruth and me, and I went to school in flour sack blouses and did not think twice about it because so did half the other girls. Clothes were mended until they could not be mended anymore, and then they became rags, and the rags became stuffing or scraps for a quilt, and nothing was thrown away until it had been everything it could possibly be and could not be made to be anything more. We had shoes. I want to mention shoes because I understand that some children in those years did not have them, truly did not, and I do not want to be careless with my own relative comfort when I speak about those years. We had shoes, but they had to last, and when I outgrew mine they went to Ruth, who had outgrown the pair before, and by the time shoes reached James they had been worn by 4 pairs of feet, and resoled once or twice by Mr. Atchison in town, and were more memory than shoe, more palimpsest than leather. But they kept your feet off the cold ground, and that was what mattered. My father would take the worst cases to Mr. Atchison, who had a small cobbler's shop on the side street off Main that smelled of leather and rubber cement and the particular smell of heated iron, and who had a patience with worn shoes that spoke to something philosophical in his character, a willingness to find what could still be saved in things that had mostly been used up. Saturday was the day we went into town, the 6 of us piling into the truck, a 1927 Ford that my father maintained with the same meticulous attention he gave everything in his domain, coaxing it through winters that should have ended it long since, replacing parts with other parts, fashioning things himself when the right part was not available or not affordable. And the drive-in was 4 miles on the county road, and felt longer in winter, the truck slow to warm and the cab cold for the first mile, and the windows fogging and the fields going past outside, brown and frozen and enormous under the low grey sky. In town we had a list, and we stuck to the list. My mother could do the arithmetic of a grocery list in her head faster than the man at the counter could do it on paper, and she did not buy what was not on the list, not even when Ruth and I pressed our noses against the glass of the candy counter and hoped in the specific, focused, extravagant way that only children can hope for something they know they will not get. Sometimes there was a penny between the 2 of us which we would deliberate over with the gravity it deserved, standing at that counter with the jars of penny candy arrayed before us, the root beer barrels, the peppermint rounds, the little wax bottles with the sweet syrup inside, the Mary Janes, the licorice whips, and the choosing was almost better than the thing chosen, almost better than the candy itself, because in the choosing you were briefly in possession of all of it before you had to settle for one. Ruth was decisive. She could look at the jars for 30 seconds and make her choice with a certainty I envied. I took longer. I turned the possibilities over and over, and the man behind the counter waited with a patience I appreciate more now than I could then. I remember one particular winter, I must have been 7 or 8 years old, when the price of corn fell to something my father described, quietly, to my mother, at the kitchen table after he thought we were in bed, as not worth the diesel to bring it in. I remember that phrase because I was not in bed. I was at the top of the stairs in the dark, listening in the way that children eavesdrop, with the total committed attention of someone who understands that the real information about the real situation is always in the conversations that are not meant for them, not worth the diesel to bring it in. I didn't understand it fully. I was 7. But I asked Thomas the next day what it meant, and Thomas explained it to me in the careful way he had of explaining things, as though he were already much older than he was, and I understood then that we were in a difficulty more serious than usual, that the difficulty had reached a new register. My mother took in sewing that winter. She had always done sewing for us. For the family, that was simply part of what she did. But that winter she took work from other people, alterations and hemming, and sometimes making up garments from patterns for women in town who had the fabric and the need, but not the skill or the time. She did it at the kitchen table after the supper dishes were done by lamplight, her needle moving in that particular quick, quiet rhythm that I can still see if I close my eyes, the way the thread caught the light as she pulled it through. She was very good. She was, I think, better than most of the women who hired dressmakers and paid for the skill, and I think she knew it, and I think she did not say so. My father did not say much about the winter or any of the hard winters. He was not a man who said much about difficulty. He worked, he fixed things, he kept the animals alive and the equipment functional, and the barn swept and the accounts current, and on Sundays he put on his good shirt and his suit and went to church and sat in the 4th pew from the front on the left side with the same steadiness he brought to everything else. And I think now that the steadiness itself was a kind of statement, a refusal to be unmade by circumstances, a declaration that he was still here and still himself, and still doing what needed to be done. He would not have put it that way. He would have said he was just doing what needed doing, which was both entirely true and also more than it sounds. There were small pleasures that had nothing to do with money, and I want to be clear about those too, because the depression years in my memory are not all grey, not all strain and careful arithmetic and the sound of my mother's needle. There was the radio. We had one, a big console-style radio with a warm amber glow when it came on, and on Friday evenings we sometimes listened to the programmes together, all 6 of us in the parlour, the comedy programmes that made even my father laugh, a laugh that was rare enough that when it came you noticed it and felt pleased. Not because the joke was so funny, but because he was. There was the summer, which lifted things every year, which brought the garden and the long golden evenings and the fireflies at dusk that James and I would chase across the backyard until it was too dark to see, and our mother called us in. There was the Christmas when I was 9 that my mother somehow, by some alchemy I still don't fully understand, produced a turkey and a mince pie and small gifts for each of us. A book for me, Little Women, which I had wanted for 2 years, a hair ribbon for Ruth, a pocket knife for Thomas, and for James, who was 4, a toy horse that my father had carved from a scrap of walnut over the preceding weeks in the barn in the evenings, painted brown and black with shoe polish. And the warmth of that day, the way it felt possible in the middle of everything to have a day that was simply good. I think what those years gave me, looking back from 91, is a particular and lasting relationship with sufficiency. A sense of what enough means and how much room there is in it, how many pleasures fit inside it, how dignified a life can be that is organised around adequacy rather than excess. I have never been comfortable with waste, not because I was taught to moralise about it, but because I was formed in a time when waste was genuinely not possible, and by the time waste became possible for me, I'd already formed my sense of what a good life required, and waste was not part of it. Enough food, enough warmth, enough people who knew your name and showed up when you needed them. The rest was ornamentation. My mother used to say, and she said it without self-pity, which is the only way it could have been said honestly, she used to say that making do was not the same as going without. That was a distinction she held to firmly, almost as a matter of pride. Making do meant you still had something. You were working with it, shaping it, finding what it could be, refusing to let it be only what it appeared to be. Going without was different. Going without was empty, was nothing, was the families at the back door with their hats in their hands. We were, she maintained, making do, and she was right, and I have carried that distinction through a long life that has had its own varieties of difficulty, and it has served me in ways that the comfort of that insistence cannot fully account for. The depression ended, or rather it eased, and then the war came, and those were different troubles, but even those were, in their way, troubles I knew how to live inside because I had learned already that the world does not arrange itself for your convenience, and that the question is not whether difficulty will arrive but what you will do when it does. The years of the flour sack blouses and the penny candy, and my mother's needle moving by lamplight, and my father's truck coaxed through another January and the biscuit tin of Thomas's letters from the Pacific. All of it had made something in me that was quiet and that held. I do not give those years credit for everything I am, but I give them a good part of it. They were the foundry. Everything else was what came out. The people who came to the back door during those years are worth more than a sentence. They came mostly in the mornings when my father was usually in the barn or the fields. Whether this was coincidence or calculation I never knew. Whether they chose the morning because my father was not there, and it was easier to accept help from a woman than from a man, because the transaction felt less laden with humiliation when the woman answered the door. My mother received them without condescension and without false cheer, which I watched and understood as the right way, though I could not have named it at the time. She did not pretend they had not come, did not pretend the bread was anything other than bread given because they needed it. She handed it to them, and they took it, and they said, "Thank you," and she said, "You're welcome," and it was as dignified as that situation could be made to be, which is not perfectly dignified, because no such situation is, but it was respectful on both sides. The grocery store in Millbrook, Horton's General Store, which had been Horton's since before my parents were born and which would remain Horton's until the mid-1950s, when Mr. Horton's son, who had been to college and had different ideas, renamed it and reorganized it, and eventually sold it, was the centre of the town's economic life in those years, in a way that no single business is now. You could buy almost anything there: dry goods, hardware items, canned goods, fabric, thread, work boots, seed. The account book behind the counter held the running totals of half the families in town, who bought on credit during the lean months and settled in the fall when the crop money came in, if it came in. My father's name was in that book. He settled every autumn with what he could, which in the worst years was not everything, and Mr. Horton's response was always the same. He adjusted the book and said nothing beyond what was necessary. This was its own form of dignity, the dignity of a man who understood that his neighbour's difficulties were not moral failures and treated them accordingly. The radio programmes that I mentioned, the ones we listened to on Friday evenings when the week had been good enough, let me tell you more about them, because they were important in a way that entertainment is not always important, or not in exactly this way. There was a comedy programme we listened to that I cannot name with certainty now, but whose characters I can still hear in my head. Two men who played off each other with a rhythm that was different from any rhythm I heard in real life, faster and more precise and funnier than real conversation, but based on real conversation in a way that you could feel, could sense the actual human beings underneath the performance. When my father laughed at those programs, that rare, complete laugh, it was because he recognized something, some truth in the absurdity, some accuracy in the exaggeration. We all recognized it. We laughed together in the parlour on Friday evenings, and for those minutes everything outside the parlour was very far away. I want to talk about what it meant to be a girl growing up in those years, in those specific circumstances, because it is different from what it meant for Thomas or what it would mean for James, and the difference is worth saying directly. I was expected to help with the house and the garden and the kitchen, and Thomas was expected to help with the barn and the fields, and neither of us questioned this because the arrangement was so universal in that world and that time that it would have required more imagination than we possessed to question it. I did not resent helping my mother. I liked the cooking, I liked the canning, I liked the housekeeping in the specific way of a person who finds satisfaction in visible order, in the thing being done, in the shelf that was bare, now holding the jars of peaches you put up this afternoon. But I was also aware, in the way that children are aware of things before they have the language for them, that there was something different about the way the future was arranged for me and for Thomas. Thomas knew what his future looked like. It looked like this farm, or a farm like it. It had a shape. My future, as far as I could see from where I stood, was marriage, which was a shape I could not quite make out from this distance, which depended on decisions that had not yet been made by people who had not yet appeared in my life. I do not think I had a specific desire for something different at 9 or 10 or 11 years old. But I was aware of the difference. I was aware that my future had less definition, or a different kind of definition, and that this was simply the way things were, and that the way things were was not necessarily the only way things could be. The church was a significant part of life in Millbrook in those years, in the way that church is significant in rural communities, when it is the primary organising institution of the social life, which it was. We went every Sunday, the 6 of us in the truck, my mother in her good dress, my father in his suit, the children in whatever we had that was presentable. The church was First Methodist, a white building with a bell tower that I looked at every Sunday of my childhood and never tired of, the way you never tire of the things that are simply part of what Sunday looks like. The services were long by modern standards, an hour and a half, and the sermons were not always easy to follow, but there was something in the aggregate experience of being in that room with the whole community, the singing together, and the quiet together, and the standing and sitting in the shared ritual. There was something in that I found settling, even as a child who did not fully understand what she was settling into. Money in the 1930s had a different texture than it has now, a different weight and urgency, and I don't mean that figuratively. Coins were coins. You held them and felt the metal of them, felt the edge and the weight was real in a way that conveyed the seriousness of the object. A dime was a dime. It was not an abstraction or a number on a screen. It was a specific piece of metal that had come from somewhere and would go to somewhere, and its going always required a decision, always required the specific question. Is this worth it? Is this the right use of this particular piece of metal on this particular day? My mother made those decisions dozens of times a week, in the specific material form of coins counted out of the biscuit tin into her palm. The Depression was not for us the catastrophe it was for people who had more to lose. I want to be careful about this. I don't want to minimize what it was, which was real hardship, real scarcity, real daily anxiety about whether there would be enough. But we were farm people, and farm people in the Depression had, if they had land, and the land was not too depleted, and the weather was not catastrophic, a specific resilience that came from already knowing how to produce rather than only how to purchase. We grew food, we raised animals, we heated with wood, we cut ourselves. We sewed and mended and made do in ways that people who'd been living more purchasing-dependent lives suddenly had to learn and that we already knew. The Depression taught us how much we needed. We already knew how much we could make. The county road passed our house about 40 yards from the front door, and in those years the road carried a certain amount of what I now understand to have been Depression-era transient traffic. Men walking, men on bicycles, men occasionally in vehicles so worn that the vehicles seemed to be moving more by determination than by mechanical function. My mother fed them when they stopped. Not always. She couldn't always. But when there was enough and she thought the stopping was genuine, she would bring out bread and whatever else was available. My father did not comment on this. He accepted it as part of what the house was, part of what his wife did, which was to manage the resources and the generosity in whatever proportion she determined to be appropriate. Thomas's shoes. I think about Thomas's shoes sometimes, in the specific way that single images from childhood come back with a completeness that does not seem proportionate to their importance, until you understand that the importance is not in the thing, but in what the thing stood for. Thomas's shoes in the winter of 1934 had a hole in the left sole that my father patched with a piece of leather, cut from an old belt, a patch that held through the winter, and that Thomas wore with the specific dignity of a teenage boy who has decided that the condition of his shoes is not going to be the thing that defines him. He was 16. He went to school in those shoes on the county road in the Ohio winter, and he never said a word about them to anyone as far as I know, and he never seemed diminished by them, and that is the thing I remember. Not the hole or the patch, but the dignity, the particular determination not to be defeated by what the Depression had done to the Schaefer family's shoe budget. What we ate was simple, and it was enough. My mother's bread was the centre of it, the bread that was there at every meal, the bread whose smell was the smell of the house, whose texture and weight I can feel in my hands even now, dense and warm, with a crust that had real resistance to it, a crust you bit into rather than through. The butter, when there was butter we made from cream from our one dairy cow, an animal named Bess whom I considered a friend, and whose milk tasted to me entirely different from any milk I have had since. The garden provided beans and tomatoes and corn and squash, all of it canned in late summer for the winter, the shelves in the root cellar filling through August and September with the year's work preserved in glass. When you knew what went into those shelves, you did not open them carelessly. Ruth and I shared a room, and in that room over the years of our growing up together we developed the specific intimacy of sisters who are close in age and in circumstance, and who have no real choice but to work out how to be close without being too close, how to share the space and the small resources without the sharing becoming a grievance. We were different in temperament. Ruth was quieter, more observant, more inclined to think before speaking, where I was quicker and more opinionated and less patient with the thinking before speaking stage. And the difference meant that we complemented each other in some ways and irritated each other in others. The irritations were small. The complementarity was real. By the time Ruth went to Columbus for the factory work, I missed her, in a way that surprised me with its sharpness, surprised me with how thoroughly she had become part of the texture of my daily life without my having noticed, the way you don't notice the sound of a creak until it stops. If you're finding some comfort here tonight in this old woman's company, you're welcome to stay. I put a new evening like this together each week, different memories, different seasons of a life, and you are welcome to come back whenever the night feels long. Now let me tell you about school. The schoolhouse was a single room, white clapboard, sitting at the crossroads of two county roads about 1.5 miles from our house. There were 2 windows on each side, and in winter the light that came through them was thin and watery, and fell at a long angle across the rows of desks, and in summer it was bold and gold and full of dust motes moving in slow columns that seemed to have nothing to do with the business of the day. There was a woodstove at the front that was either too hot or not hot enough, depending on the week and the quality of the wood and the judgment of whoever was tending it, which in the winter months was usually one of the older boys, rotating through the duty with the solemnity it required. There were 2 rows of coat hooks by the door that got intensely crowded in December and January when everyone arrived in their heaviest coats, and a map of the United States on the front wall that had the territories wrong because it was older than anyone cared to admit and no one had gotten around to replacing it. So we learned geography that was partially historical without knowing it. There were perhaps 25 children on any given day, spread across 8 grades, all in that one room with one teacher. When I started, the teacher was Miss Halliburton, who was young and from Columbus, and who had a quality of brisk, determined cheerfulness that I found, even as a child, slightly alarming. The way people who are committed to being cheerful in all circumstances can be alarming because you suspect they are working at it harder than it appears. She was a good teacher, though. She had to be, to manage 8 grades at once, to keep the older ones occupied while she worked with the younger ones, to hear reading in one corner while arithmetic was happening in another, to manage the full spectrum of ages and abilities and moods that 25 children across 8 grades represent on any given November morning. I think about what that required now, and I am impressed in a way I was not capable of being at 6. I liked school. That was not a foregone conclusion in my family. Thomas tolerated it. Ruth endured it with an air of someone serving a sentence before her real life could begin. James, later, evaded it with a creative persistence that exhausted my mother, but I genuinely liked it from the first day. I liked the organised way the day was arranged, liked the smell of chalk and the feel of the slate under my hand when I wrote on it, liked the readers, which opened things in a way that nothing else quite did. I was a good reader from early on, picking it up in the way that some children do, as though the skill had been waiting for them and only needed the occasion to arrive. Miss Halliburton told my mother this at one of those informal conferences that happened at the edge of a Sunday social, and my mother reported it to my father that evening with a pride she tried to make sound matter-of-fact and didn't quite manage, and I lay awake in the room I shared with Ruth and listened through the wall and felt something warm and solid settle in my chest that was not pride exactly, or not only pride, but something more like recognition, like being told something true about yourself that you had suspected but not yet confirmed. The books available to us were limited but sufficient. The school had a small shelf of readers and a few reference books and a set of encyclopedias that was also older than it should have been, and the Millbrook Library, which was in a room at the back of the town hall and smelled of old paper and dust and something slightly sweet that I never identified, candle wax perhaps, or the particular dry decay of very old spines, was open on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons. My mother would sometimes bring me in with her on those afternoons when she had business in town, and I would go straight to that back room and stand in front of the shelves, with the focused attention of someone choosing something important, which I was, and choose as many books as I was allowed to take home, which was 3, and carry them out in my arms with the care you give to something you know you are lucky to have. The first book I read entirely on my own, the first one that made me forget where I was and replace where I was with somewhere else, was a copy of Little Women that I found on the library shelf when I was 8 years old. It had a blue cover, and the pages were soft from being handled by many hands before mine, and I carried it home under my arm on a cold February Tuesday, and sat down at the kitchen table after supper and read until my mother told me once to go to bed, and then twice, and then stood in the doorway of the kitchen with the lamp in her hand and said, "Eleanor, I mean it," and I went. I don't know how to explain what that book did to me. The way it made a world that was simultaneously entirely unlike mine and entirely recognisable in its feelings and its domestic textures. The way it showed me that the inside of other people's lives had the same quality as the inside of mine, the same mix of ordinary and significant, the same love that is sometimes exasperated, the same grief that is ordinary but nonetheless grief, the same desire for more without ingratitude for what you have. I understood something that evening that I could not have articulated at 8, but that I have been trying to articulate for the rest of my life, that other people are as real as you are, that the whole vast human world is made of people who feel exactly as much as you feel, exactly as completely and seriously, and that this is not sad but is in fact the most hopeful thing there is. There was a girl at school named Margaret Schultz whose father worked for the railroad and who had been to Chicago twice. Chicago. The word itself had a weight that Millbrook did not have, a denseness of significance, and Margaret talked about it with a casualness that I found both admirable and slightly suspect. The particular casualness of someone who wants you to know they have been somewhere you haven't. But underneath my scepticism was something simpler and more honest, which was longing. Not painful longing, not the kind that makes you unhappy, just the specific and clean ache of wanting to see something you have not seen, to know something you do not know, to stand somewhere else for a little while and look back at where you came from and understand it differently. I have felt that ache all my life, for different things, and I do not think it is an unpleasant feeling. It is the feeling of being alive and interested in what life contains. The radio was a different kind of window, and we were lucky to have one. Not everyone in those years had one. It required electricity, which was not universal in rural Ohio in the 1930s, or battery power, which cost money. But we had ours by the time I was 6 or 7, a console radio that sat in the corner of the parlour and occupied its space with the importance of a piece of furniture much larger than it was. It ran on electricity because my father had arranged for the farmhouse to have power in the late 20s, which was forward-thinking of him and which gave us a small advantage in those years, though he would not have called it that. He was not a man who enumerated his advantages. The radio cost something to run, so we were judicious about when we turned it on, but what came out of it when we did? The voices from far away, the music, the news, the comedy programs with their audiences laughing in studios in New York or Los Angeles, laughing at the same jokes we were laughing at in this farmhouse in Ohio. All of it was extraordinary to me. It was the world coming in, uninvited and regular, through the speaker. I remember the first time I heard a symphony orchestra on the radio. I was 9 or 10 years old. I don't know what the piece was, didn't have the language yet to know, but there was a moment when all the instruments came together in a way that was so much larger than anything I'd heard before that I stopped what I was doing and just stood in the middle of the parlour, absolutely still, with my arms at my sides, and felt something move through the room that was like weather, like a change in the pressure of the air. My father lowered his farm paper and looked at me and then looked back at his paper, but he left the radio on. I have thought about that moment many times since. The music was not the point, or not the whole point. The point was the understanding that arrived with it, that this was in the world. That someone had made this and other people were listening to it right now in many rooms, and the world was full of things I had not yet encountered that were like this, that large, that surprising, that worth standing still for. Miss Halliburton left after my 3rd grade and was replaced by a man named Mr. Bowden, who was older and quieter and taught history as though it were happening right now, with an urgency that I found electrifying. He was the one who made me understand that the past was not a collection of facts to be memorized, but a set of things that had actually happened to people who were exactly as alive as I was, who had gone to bed not knowing what would come next, who had made choices in ignorance of their consequences, exactly as I was doing right now every day. He said this, or something like it, in the first week of school, and I wrote it down in my notebook and kept that notebook, And when I find things like that in old notebooks now, I understand why I kept them. They contain the moments when someone changed something in you that needed changing. Those school years were also the years of my friendship with Loretta Haynes, who lived 2 farms over and who was my closest companion from 2nd grade until we married, years later, on opposite ends of the state, and mostly lost each other to the distance and the difference in the way marriages and geography can make you lose people you never intended to lose. Loretta was quick and funny, and not afraid of anything in the specific fearlessness of girls who have been raised with brothers and have learned that the best response to being underestimated is to be amused by it. She taught me to catch crawdads in the creek and to whistle through 2 fingers and to read the sky for weather in a way that was different from anything my father had taught me. He read weather systematically, Loretta read it instinctively, and hers was often more accurate. We walked to school together most mornings and home again in the afternoons, and those walks were where I learned to have the kind of conversation where you're not performing for anyone, where you can say what you actually think and have it heard without consequence. That kind of conversation is rare. I was lucky to find it early. By the time I was 12 or 13, I'd begun to understand that the world was much larger than Millbrook, Ohio, and that the distance between me and the rest of it was real, but not necessarily permanent. This understanding arrived in pieces, through books and the radio and the Saturday Evening Post, and through conversations with Mr. Bowden about history, and through Margaret Schultz's unsolicited reports from Chicago, and when it was fully assembled it changed something in the way I held myself in my own life. Not dramatically, not in a way that anyone would have noticed from the outside, but in the way you stand differently when you understand that a room has more than one door. I was not unhappy in Millbrook. I was not restless to leave, but I was awake, in a new way, to the fact that there was more, and that the more was not theoretical. I stayed in school through the 8th grade, which was common for girls in those years and those circumstances. Some went further. Ruth did eventually. She finished high school in Millbrook before going to Columbus, and that completion was a point of pride in the family that my parents wore quietly but wore. But for me, the 8th grade completed something in its own way. And then there was the work of the house and the garden, and the particular education of being 15 and 16 in a world that was recovering from one depression and heading toward a war, a world that was asking everyone in it, including girls in farmhouses in Ohio, to adjust their understanding of what life was going to require. I want to tell you about Mr. Bowden more, because he mattered in a way that teachers sometimes matter when they arrive at the right moment in a person's formation. He was a small man, Mr. Bowden, with round glasses and a habit of tilting his head slightly to one side when he was considering something, which gave him an air of permanent inquiry. He had taught at various schools around the state before arriving in Millbrook, and you could sense the accumulated experience in him, the deep familiarity with children of many kinds and circumstances, the patience of someone who had learned that understanding comes to different people at different times, and that the teacher's job is to be present when it arrives rather than to force the schedule. He taught us history by telling us stories, which sounds obvious but was not at the time, not in the way most history was taught in those years, which was as a sequence of dates and names and events to be memorized and reproduced on a test. Mr. Bowden's history was full of people, of their choices and their fears and their mistakes and their moments of unexpected courage, and the people were as complicated as the people we knew in our own lives, not heroes and villains but people, doing the best they could with the information they had at the moment they had it. This seems to me now like the only sensible way to teach history. At 12 it seemed revolutionary. He also taught me something about reading that I have carried my whole life, something he said once in a lesson about a book I no longer remember, which was that the question to ask of any text is not what does it say, but what does it not say? What are the silences and whose silences are they, and why? I was 12 years old and I wrote this in my notebook, the way I wrote the other things he said that seemed important, and I have been asking that question of texts and of situations and of people ever since, and it has never failed to be useful. Loretta Haynes. I cannot talk about those school years without talking more about Loretta, because she was as much the education as the school was. What she taught me was how to be a friend. Not in the abstract, but in the specific practice of it. How to be curious about another person without making them feel observed, how to disagree without it being threatening, how to be honest without being cruel, how to be present with someone who is having a hard day without trying to fix the day or minimize it or turn it into something less than it is. These are skills, though we don't usually call them that. They require practice and failure and adjustment, like any skill, and I practiced them with Loretta for years. She had a quality of directness that I found bracing, and that some people found alarming. She would simply tell you what she thought, about most things, without the social padding that most girls our age used, the qualifications and the softening and the check that you were ready before she said the thing. She told me once, in 5th grade, that I was spending too much time trying to figure out what people wanted me to be, and not enough time being what I was, and she was right, and I knew she was right, and the knowing arrived in that particular way that a true thing arrives when someone says it to you for the first time, with something like relief, as though you had known it yourself and needed someone else to confirm it. After school in the afternoons, in the warm months, Loretta and I would take the long way home by the creek, which added maybe 20 minutes to the walk, and which our mothers tolerated as long as we were home before supper. The creek was not much, 2 or 3 feet wide in most places, clear over a bottom of flat stones running fast in spring and slow in August. But it was ours in the way that a place is yours when you have spent hours in it, without any purpose other than being in it. We took our shoes off and waded in the cold water and caught crawdads in our hands and put them back, and we talked about everything and nothing in the specific way of adolescent girls, which is with a freedom and an urgency and a willingness to say the actual thing that I have rarely found again in any other context. The summers between the school years were their own education. I learned to drive when I was 15, taught by Thomas in the truck on the county roads on the dry August afternoons, when the fields were harvested and the roads were empty, Thomas infinitely patient, which was not his general quality, but which he seemed to find specifically for this task. I learned to sew from my mother, not the rough utilitarian sewing she did, but the finer kind, the kind that could make something look like it had been purchased, and I made Ruth a blouse for her birthday in 1945 that she actually wore to the church social, which was the highest possible endorsement. I learned the particular arithmetic of a household budget from watching my mother all those years, and then from doing it myself, and I learned to make bread reliably, and to can, and to tend a kitchen garden, and to do all the things that women of my time and place were expected to know, and that I'm glad I know, regardless of what I think about the expectation. There was a teacher before Mr. Bowden, a Miss Garfield who taught the lower grades, who had a quality I have thought about often since. She treated the children in her classroom as though their understanding mattered, as though the question of whether they had genuinely grasped something was more important than the question of whether they had correctly repeated it. This was not common. Most of the teaching I experienced was the transmission of content, and the verification that the content had been received, with the reception measured by the ability to produce the content on request. Miss Garfield was after something different, after the understanding, and she would ask questions. Not the questions with one correct answer, but the questions that had several possible answers, and that required the child to think about which one they would defend and why. I was 7 years old, and I was being asked why. It changed something in me about what thinking was for. The radio, in those years, was the technology that changed the world, and I say technology with the full awareness that the word has since been reassigned to things with screens and chips. But the radio was technology in the most meaningful sense, a thing that did not exist and then did, and whose existence altered the basic conditions of how information and entertainment and culture moved through the world. Before the radio, if you were in rural Ohio, you were substantially cut off from the rest of the country. The newspaper was a day late. The mail was slower still. What you knew about the rest of the world was filtered through what arrived in paper and what people told each other. The radio changed that completely, instantly, by putting the rest of the world's voices into your kitchen in real time. I was 10 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I remember where I was, at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon, doing schoolwork that needed to be done before Monday and that I had been putting off, the way you put off the things you have to do in favour of the things you want to do. The radio was playing in the parlour. My mother sometimes left it on while she worked, as company, the way you might leave a window open for the air. And then the programme stopped in the way that programmes stopped when something had happened that was more important than the programmes, and a voice came on that had a quality I had never heard before from a radio, a quality of urgency controlled very tightly by professionalism, and it said what it said. My mother came to the doorway of the kitchen with an expression on her face that I had never seen before and did not have a name for. Something that was not fear exactly, but was in the neighbourhood of fear, something that was the expression of a person who has just heard something they knew was a possibility and who is now confronting the fact that the possibility has become an event. She said, quietly, almost to herself more than to me, that we were in the war now, and then she went back to the parlour and turned the radio up, and I followed her and we stood there together in the parlour, my mother and I, listening to the voice. My father's first response was to go out to the barn. I don't know what he did out there. I think he needed to be somewhere he understood completely, somewhere whose requirements were clear and known, because in the parlour with the radio going and the world reorganising itself, nothing was clear. He was 39 in 1941, too old for the draft, which was not called a draft then, but was in effect one. But Thomas was 17, and that was the arithmetic that everyone in the room was doing simultaneously, even if no one said it out loud. 17 in December of 1941, 18 in May of 1942. Thomas enlisted in the spring of 1942 on a Tuesday in May, which was too warm and too full of birdsong for what it was. He was 18 by then, finished with his year of high school, and there was no possibility of stopping him. Every boy he knew was enlisting or had already enlisted or was about to, and to stand apart from that would have required a kind of argument, a kind of explanation that none of us could find the words for or the justification to make. He left on a grey morning in a borrowed truck driven by his friend Harvey Carver, and my mother stood on the sagging left side of the porch and watched the truck go down the road, and then watched the road after the truck was gone, and then went inside. I heard her through the wall of the kitchen making a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not crying exactly, or not only crying. Something deeper than that. Something that went below the words for sadness into something that had no words, only sound. Letters came. Thomas wrote when he could, which was not as often as we would have liked and more often than some families got. And I know now how important the more often than some was, how many families got nothing, or got the telegram instead of the letter, and I carry that knowledge alongside my own experience of those years. The letters were brief and careful, and told us almost nothing about where he was or what he was doing, because the censor's lines took care of that. There was something terrible about those black lines, the way they removed the specific and left only the general, so you knew your son was somewhere and alive at the moment of writing but could not know more than that. My mother kept them in a biscuit tin on the shelf above the kitchen window, and I know she read them more than once, more than many times, the way you read things that are the only version you have of something you cannot get more of. The war came into the house in other ways too, smaller and more daily. The ration books arrived in 1942, little brown booklets with their pages of stamps, the careful rationing of sugar and coffee and meat and butter and gasoline and tyres and shoes. The list grew and shifted and adapted as the war went on, and as the needs of the war changed, and my mother adapted with it. She reorganised her cooking around what was available, discovered or invented substitutions, and did it with the same methodical practicality she brought to every constraint. She made molasses cake when sugar was tight. She made soup from the things she had rather than the things the recipe called for. She was good at it, and I watched how she did it, and I remember it, and it is one of the things that has stood me in good stead for the rest of my life, knowing how to cook from what you have. Gasoline rationing changed the daily texture of life in ways that were difficult to articulate at the time. We drove only when there was no alternative. My father managed the farm still, but trips to town were consolidated and planned. The truck sitting in the yard on most days in a way it never had before. The radius of our world contracted. Millbrook was as far as we generally went, and Millbrook, which had always felt like enough, became the whole world during those years in a way that was both fine and not fine. That was simply the reality of it, the given condition inside which you made your life. We planted a victory garden, as every family with any land at all was doing, expanding the kitchen garden to take up most of the backyard. My mother had always been a serious gardener, but now she gardened with an additional dimension of purpose, a sense that the zucchini and the green beans were connected somehow to the larger thing, to Thomas wherever he was and to the men in the newspapers and to the general project of everyone doing what they could. I don't know how many pounds of canned tomatoes constitute a material contribution to a war, but the feeling of contributing was real, and it mattered to her, and I think it mattered to all of us in the quiet way that things matter when you are otherwise helpless. Ruth finished high school in 1943 and went to work in Columbus, at a factory that was making instrument panels for airplanes, which was the kind of work that opened up for women during the war in ways it had not been open before and would not in many cases remain open after. She sent money home, a portion of every paycheck reliably without being asked, which told you something about Ruth that the rest of her behaviour sometimes obscured. She wrote letters that were livelier than Thomas's, full of the detail of the city and the women she worked alongside and the dances that happened on Saturday nights at the USO Hall, which she described with careful vagueness on the subject of the men she danced with. I missed Ruth. The house without her had a different sound, as though something that had been creating a particular kind of friction was no longer there to create it, and the friction, it turned out, had been interesting. My role during those years, beyond school, was to help my mother with everything. The expanded garden, the canning, the cooking, the management of the household that shifted as the adults in it were increasingly occupied. I learned to can tomatoes and corn and green beans and peaches and the dill pickles that my father liked, and that were a production requiring exact amounts of vinegar and dill, and the careful sterilisation of jars that my mother supervised, and that I eventually took over entirely. I learned to bake bread reliably, which required the understanding that bread is forgiving of some errors and merciless about others, and that learning which requires failure, and that failure with bread is not so bad because something still comes out of it. Something baked and edible and usually the right shape even when the texture is wrong. I learned to keep the household accounts in that small lined notebook. This was a practical education in the arithmetic of daily life that no school I attended ever made explicit. What things cost against what you had, what you could do without and what you couldn't, how to make an estimate hold across a month, how to find a dollar that wasn't there. My mother taught me this without naming it as teaching. She just handed me the notebook one autumn day in 1943 and told me to take it over, and I did, and I made mistakes, and she corrected them, and I made fewer mistakes, and by the following year the accounts were mine in a way that I had earned. There were 4 young men from our church who did not come home from that war. I won't say their names tonight because they belong to their families more than to this story, but I knew them, knew their faces from Sunday mornings and school, and from the way a small town holds everyone in it, in a shared memory that is difficult to explain to people who have not lived inside one. When their names appeared in the newspaper, and the telegram boys drove up to the houses on their bicycles, I felt something that I could not fully process at 13 and 14, something that sat in the chest and did not move, something that was about the reality of death as something that happened to actual people, not to the people in books or the people in history, but to the people whose faces you knew, and whose voices you could still hear if you tried. Thomas came home in the fall of 1945, thinner and quieter, and with something behind his eyes that had not been there when he left. He was 21 years old, and he had been to the Pacific, the specific geography of where and what he never said, not to us, not in those years. And he came back to a farm in Ohio and a family that was relieved in a way that made all of us slightly uncertain how to act, the way immense relief can make you awkward when what you need is to be natural. My father shook his hand, which was the most physical contact I ever saw them have. My mother made a roast, saving points for weeks. We sat around the table and ate and talked about everything except the war, which was the only subject that was actually interesting, and which none of us had the language to open. The war ended and things began to change, slowly, and then less slowly. The rationing lifted, item by item, and you could buy things again without calculating, and this felt at first remarkable, and then merely normal, and then so normal that the period of scarcity receded in memory to the point where it required some effort to recall the specific texture of it. That is how it is with the extraordinary things you live through. They become the past, and the past becomes what you look back at rather than what you live in, and the living was so much more than the looking back can hold. The home front had its own particular quality during those years that is difficult to describe to someone who did not experience it, because it was not drama. It was sustained low-grade alertness, the ongoing condition of people who are waiting for news and who must in the meantime continue to live their lives. You went to school, you canned the tomatoes, you helped with the garden, you went to church on Sunday, and underneath all of it, underneath the ordinary texture of the days, was the knowledge that Thomas was somewhere in the Pacific and that the news could change at any moment. You did not dwell on this continuously. You couldn't, not and function. But you did not forget it either. It was present the way that certain kinds of weather are present, not always visible, but always felt. My mother's relationship with the radio changed during the war. Before the war, she'd used it selectively, for the entertainment programs and the occasional news broadcast. During the war, she listened to the news every day, morning and evening, with a focused attention that had nothing to do with the programs and everything to do with what the program said or didn't say about where the fighting was and how it was going. She never discussed this with us directly. She maintained, with Thomas away, a careful composure that I understand now as one of the great achievements of her life. The composure of a woman who is terrified for her child and who has decided that she will not let the terror become the household's atmosphere. But I would find her sometimes at the radio, standing close to the speaker with her eyes slightly unfocused, listening to the voice from somewhere in the Pacific that was not saying what she needed it to say, and in those moments I would quietly leave the room. Ruth's letters from Columbus were important for a different reason. They opened a window into a world I had not seen, the world of women doing work that had previously been classified as men's work, doing it well, knowing it was temporary, knowing that when the men came home they would be expected to step back, and not quite believing, or not quite knowing whether to believe, that the step back was going to be as clean and complete as everyone assumed. She wrote about the women she worked with in a way that suggested she was paying close attention, watching them the way she had always watched things, with that Ruth quality of storing information about the world that she expected to use later. The factory was loud and the hours were long and the work was real and requiring, and she was proud of doing it. The pride came through in the letters even when she wasn't saying it directly. I worked harder during the war years than I had before, and I think this was partly what you do when someone you love is in danger, and you cannot do anything direct about the danger. You do something, the thing that is available, you work harder, and you make the thing you're making better than it needs to be. Because the making is what you have, and the work is what connects you to the effort that is happening elsewhere. I canned more than my mother told me to. I kept the accounts with a precision beyond what was required. I helped in the garden in the early morning before school, something I had not done before the war. I don't know if any of this was useful in the practical sense. I think it was useful in the sense that it gave me something to do with the energy that had nowhere else to go. There was a particular quality to the Sundays during the war years that I have thought about a lot over the years since. We would come home from church and have dinner, which my mother had prepared the night before so that Sunday cooking was minimal, and then the afternoon would open up, and there was a quality to those Sunday afternoons. The specific combination of the Sunday quiet, and the ongoing awareness of the war, and the particular light of whatever season it was, that I still feel when I think about them, still feel in my chest, not as pain but as something with weight to it, something that is not sadness but is in the neighbourhood of sadness, the way the minor key of a song is in the neighbourhood of sadness without quite being it. Thomas came home thin. I noticed that first, the thinness of him, the way his suit coat hung differently than it had when he left, the way his hands seemed too large for his arms. He was also quieter. Not the quiet of my father, which was a natural quiet, a baseline quality of the man. This was a different kind of quiet, the quiet of someone who has set a great deal aside and does not yet know whether he will be able to retrieve it or whether it should stay where it is. We did not ask. The culture of that time did not ask. Men came home from that war, and the understanding was that they had done what they had to do, and that what they had done was to be folded away now, returned to, allowed to be past, and that the appropriate response from the people who loved them was to help maintain the fiction that it was already past. I understand now how much that cost the men who came home. I did not understand it then. The Victory Garden was my mother's project, though the government called it a Victory Garden and gave it a flag to put in the window. She had always grown a kitchen garden. There was no year in my childhood when there was not a garden. But during the war years the garden expanded, took over more of the yard, became something beyond utility. I think it was her version of the same thing I was doing with the extra canning and the precise accounts. The garden was what she could do. The ground was what she could work, the seeds were what she could put in and tend and bring to harvest, and she did it with an intensity that went beyond what the household needed, and that was not about the household. It was about Thomas. The garden was where she put the fear she would not put in her face. I learned patience from the war years, not the false patience of someone who has suppressed their impatience, actual patience, the understanding that there are conditions of life in which waiting is the only available action, and that waiting done with grace is a skill and not merely a condition. I waited for the news. I waited for Thomas's letters. I waited for the war to end. I became, in those 4 years, good at the interior space of waiting, which is what I mean by patience, not the absence of wanting it to be over, but the ability to be present while it is not yet over, to continue to function and to be of use, and to find the ordinary pleasures of the ordinary days while the thing you are waiting for has not yet arrived. I met Harold in the summer of 1949 at a church social, which is where most people in Millbrook met most of the people who mattered to them. I was 18 years old and had been working for 2 years in the office of the grain elevator on the east end of town doing the accounts and the correspondence. A job I had gotten because my reputation for keeping a straight ledger had gotten to Mr. Simmons, who ran the elevator before I did. Harold was 23, working at the hardware store his uncle owned, and someone introduced us in the way that people get introduced at church socials, which is with a particular efficiency of biography, who your people were, where you were from, what you did. Harold Marsh, his people are from Athens, works at Dwight Marsh's hardware. Eleanor Schaefer, Vivian and Leonard Schaefer's girl, out on Route 12. The introducer moves on, and you are left standing with this person you have been assigned to, holding your punch glass. I did not fall in love with him immediately. I want to say that honestly because I think the stories we tell about falling in love have always made it sound more sudden than it usually is, more like weather, struck, swept away, when the reality is usually more like a season, a gradual change in what you notice and what you look forward to, and who you find yourself thinking about at odd moments of the day. What I felt immediately was interest. He was interesting to me in a way that most of the young men I knew were not, and I do not mean that to diminish the young men I knew. They were fine young men, most of them, who lived good lives. But Harold had read things and had opinions about them. He was willing to defend and had a quality of paying attention when you talked that I found unusual and very attractive, that quality of actually listening rather than simply waiting for you to finish. We talked for 45 minutes at that punch table, which I know because I was aware of time in the acute way you are aware of it, when you are enjoying something and afraid it will end. We talked about books. He had read The Grapes of Wrath, which I had also read, from the library, and he had strong feelings about it that were different from mine, and the arguing about it was its own pleasure, the kind of argument where you're not trying to win but are trying to understand something, and the other person is helping you understand it even when they disagree. We talked about the town and what it was and wasn't. We talked about what we had wanted to do and what we still might do, and how you knew the difference between wanting something that was possible and wanting something that was only a feeling. He asked me questions and waited for the answers with a stillness that was not blankness but attention, a quality of being present in the conversation that I recognized from my father and had not expected to find in someone Harold's age. He courted me in the way that courtship worked in 1949 in a small Ohio town, which was carefully and visibly, and with each stage understood by everyone involved, including the parents. Sunday afternoon visits to the house on Maple Street, where my family had moved when the farm was sold in 1946, after my grandfather's death freed my father from the land he'd been farming and made it possible for him to work at the grain elevator alongside me. Harold would come in the afternoon and my mother would make lemonade, and my father would sit in the parlour with his newspaper, with an elaborate unobtrusiveness that fooled none of us. Harold and I sat on the front porch and talked, and in the evenings in summer the lightning bugs came up out of the yard and the air smelled of grass and someone's supper, and it was very ordinary and very pleasant, and I knew, by the 3rd or 4th Sunday, that it was going to become more than this. He asked my father for permission before he asked me, which was the custom, and I am of two minds about that custom now in a way that I was not then. Then, I accepted it as simply what was done, the form of the thing, and the form told you that it was serious and that the people in it took it seriously, and that was its own kind of reassurance. Now I understand it differently, understand what it meant about who had authority over what, about who was being consulted in the arrangement of a woman's life. And I feel a complicated thing about it that includes gratitude for what my father said, and discomfort about the fact that he was the one being asked. My father said yes. He told me later that he said it without hesitation, which I believe, because he liked Harold in the way he liked people who showed him by their actions what they were, without a lot of speech around it. Harold proposed on the front porch on a September evening in 1950, with the fireflies still going in the yard and the sky doing something complicated and beautiful in the west, that late September light that has a quality of gold and grief together, the last of the summer making itself known before the cold. He was not dramatic about it. He was not a dramatic man. He simply said what he wanted to say, which was that he would like to marry me if I was willing, and asked me if I was willing. I said yes. We sat on the porch for a while longer, and then he went home, and I went inside and told my mother, who said, with her characteristic efficiency of sentiment, that she thought that was the right thing. We married the following June, on a Saturday at Millbrook First Methodist, in a dress my mother made from a pattern in a women's magazine that she modified in 4 places, because she had strong views about what flattered and what did not, and she was correct about all 4 modifications, and the dress was simple and white and exactly right. I wore my grandmother's cameo at the neck, the small oval brooch that I am wearing tonight, that I wear most days, that has been part of my person for so long that I sometimes forget it is there, in the way you forget the things that are most constant. The reception was in the church hall. My mother and 2 of her friends made the cake. 4 layers with white frosting and small roses on top. There were sandwiches and deviled eggs and a punch that someone's husband improved with bourbon, which no one mentioned. The whole town came, or the part of it we knew, and there was a record player and dancing, and it was a fine day, the way that days are fine when they are exactly what they are supposed to be, and nothing goes wrong, and you're too young and happy to know how rare that is. What marriage looked like then. I have thought about how to say this honestly, and what I keep arriving at is that marriage in 1951 was an institution I entered with fewer negotiations than I would encourage any young woman to enter it with today. We did not discuss what our life would look like. We did not make explicit agreements about who would do what, and who would have authority over what. It was simply understood. Understood the way that grammar is understood before you know the rules, at the level of assumption rather than agreement, that Harold would work and I would keep the house. I was not unhappy with this arrangement at 20 years old. I had not yet developed the vocabulary to be unhappy with it, or the experience to understand what it would cost me when, 15 years in, I found myself wanting something that the arrangement had not provided room for. But that is a later story. We moved into the small house on Elm Street that Harold's uncle rented us at a rate that was below market, and that constituted a gift that Harold received with gratitude, and that I received with the mixed feelings that come with receiving gifts that carry an obligation of gratitude. It was 2 bedrooms, a kitchen that faced the backyard, a parlour with south-facing windows that made it warm in the winter afternoons, and a cellar that smelled of damp earth and old wood, and that I filled over the first few years with the canned goods and the preserved things that I had learned from my mother to put by. I made curtains for the windows from blue and white checked cotton that I found at the dry goods store and thought was cheerful. Harold said they were fine. He didn't care about curtains, which I found immediately endearing about him. Some men pretend they care about curtains when they don't, which is a variety of condescension disguised as participation. Harold simply didn't care and said so, and the curtains were my business entirely, which was as it should be. The early months of marriage have a quality that is distinct from anything before or after them. You're living with someone in the intimate way for the first time, which means you are discovering them in the way that proximity reveals people, the habits and the preferences and the small idiosyncrasies that you did not know from Sunday afternoon visits on the front porch. Harold was meticulous about his appearance and casual about the house. He could spend 20 minutes on his hair, but leave his breakfast dishes in the sink in a way that would have driven my mother to distraction. I was organised and systematic about the house, but had a sharpness when I was tired that surprised both of us the first time it appeared, and that we had to learn to account for and to navigate around. I want to say something careful about those first years of marriage because I think they are often described in a way that doesn't quite account for what they are. They were good years. They were genuinely good. I want to be clear about that, but they were also years of negotiation and adjustment, and of learning that the person you married is more complicated than the person you courted, and that more complicated is fine, that it is in fact required for a real marriage rather than a projected one, but that the complication requires work that no one tells you about in advance. The work is not hard work in the way that physical labour is hard. It is more like the work of attention, of paying careful, ongoing attention to another person and to the relationship you are building together, and of making 1,000 small adjustments over time that together constitute the life. Harold was a good man. I keep arriving back at that phrase, which seems too simple for what I mean by it, but which I cannot improve upon. He was honest, and he was kind, and he was steady, and those three things together made a life possible in a way that no other combination I can think of quite does. He was honest in the way that means he told you what he actually thought, rather than what he thought you wanted to hear, which was sometimes inconvenient and always useful. He was kind in the way that means he was genuinely interested in other people, not as a performance of interest, but as a fact about his character. He was steady in the way that means when things were difficult, he was still there, in the same form, doing what was required, and you could count on that, and you did count on it, and it was the foundation of everything. I loved him. I want to say that simply and without ornament, because it is the simplest and truest thing I can say about the 39 years we had. I loved him in the way that changes as you age together, that begins as one thing and becomes another and then another, each version of a love layered over the ones before, so that what you have at the end is not a single thing but an accumulated thing, a sediment of feeling that is solid in the way that only years can make it. The Eleanor who stood on the church porch in June of 1951 and waited for the ceremony to begin did not know what that love would become. That was right. She couldn't have known. Some things have to unfold in time to be understood, and love is one of them. The grain elevator office, where I worked from 1947 to 1951 before I married Harold, was a plain building at the east end of Main Street with a scale in the front room and a desk in the back room, and a view, if you sat at a certain angle, of the water tower. It was the kind of job that was available to girls of my background and education in small-town Ohio in 1947, which was limited to the arithmetic and the paperwork, the things that required accuracy and patience and that no one thought to be ambitious about. I was accurate and patient, and I was also, in that quiet back room with its view of the water tower, becoming something else. Someone who understood the practical and financial workings of a business from the inside, who could read a set of accounts and understand not just what the numbers said, but what they implied, what they meant about the health of the enterprise and what was likely to be needed next. Mr. Simmons, who owned the elevator, was a taciturn man who communicated primarily by clearing his throat and adjusting his hat, and who over 4 years of working together taught me, by example and without commentary, what it looks like to run a business honestly. He paid his accounts on time. He was fair with the farmers, even the ones he didn't particularly like, because the transaction mattered more to him than the relationship, which is not a common quality. He never asked me to do anything I should not have done, never made me uncomfortable in the office, which I note because it was not universal, because not everyone was like Mr. Simmons, which is something young women of that era and this era understand in a particular and practical way. Harold and I were engaged for 8 months before the wedding, and those 8 months had a quality that I look back on with something like nostalgia, for the specific pleasure of anticipation, for the state of knowing something good is coming and being in the pleasant suspension before it arrives. We went to the pictures on Saturday nights when the weather was good, and to the church socials and to Sunday dinners at his uncle's house, which Harold dreaded slightly because his Uncle Dwight had opinions about everything and was not shy about sharing them. I liked Dwight, actually, liked his bluntness, liked that you always knew what you were getting. He tested Harold in the specific way that successful uncles test the young men they have helped, wanted to know whether Harold was going to be the kind of man who could take the business and do something with it, or whether he was going to be the kind of man who simply did what he was told for 40 years and then retired. Harold was the former, and Dwight knew it, and after a year or so of testing he stopped testing and the Sunday dinners became less fraught. My mother and Harold got along from the first visit, which surprised me a little because my mother was not an easy person to get along with, in the sense that she had high standards and was not good at pretending otherwise. But she recognised in Harold the same quality my father had that she most respected, which was the quality of doing what you said you would do and not making a production of it. He showed up when he said he would show up. He helped when there was something to help with. He talked to my father about things my father was interested in, the land, the farm machinery, the crop prices, and listened with genuine interest, which was not difficult for Harold because he was genuinely interested in almost everything. My father said to me once, shortly before the wedding, that Harold seemed like a man who would wear well, which was the highest possible compliment from my father in those words. The wedding preparations were my mother's great project of that winter and spring. She had opinions about every element, the dress, the cake, the flowers, the order of the ceremony, the food at the reception, and she executed her opinions with the same meticulous efficiency she brought to the canning and the bread. The flowers were from the garden, white and pale pink, arranged by two of the women from the church the morning of the wedding. The music was played by the church organist, a Mrs. Paulson who had been playing that organ since before I was born and who played it with a certainty and a fullness that was exactly what you wanted for a wedding. Nothing experimental, nothing uncertain, just the familiar hymns given their full weight. I was not nervous the morning of the wedding, which surprised me. I'd expected to be nervous. Everyone told me I would be. Everyone who'd been married seemed to want to share the experience of the nerves, the shaking hands and the dry mouth. But what I felt instead was a kind of settled sureness, the feeling of arriving at something I had been moving toward for long enough that arriving at it felt right, rather than alarming. I had made my decision. I'd made it over 8 months of Sunday afternoons on the porch and Saturday nights at the pictures, and Wednesday evenings at the hardware store when I would come in to talk to Harold when Mr. Dwight had gone home, and the decision was clear and good and I was not afraid of it. I was ready. The dress was right. The cameo was at my neck. And at the front of the church Harold was standing in his good suit, and when I came down the aisle he looked at me the way he had looked at Catherine when she was born, with that expression that was beyond words for gladness, and I thought, yes, this is the right thing. I was right. The courtship itself, the 8 months between Harold asking me to go to the pictures and the June morning when I walked down the aisle, had a quality that I want to preserve more carefully in the telling, because courtship in 1950 and 1951 was a particular kind of experience that no longer exists and that deserves an honest account. There were rules, explicit and implicit, about what could happen and when and in what company, and the rules were not entirely without wisdom. They created a structure inside which two people could learn each other with a certain amount of protection from the pace of their own feeling, a certain enforced slowness that is not without value. Harold and I held hands in the cinema starting the 3rd time we went. We did not kiss until the 7th week. By the time we were engaged, we knew each other's minds extremely well, and each other's faces almost as well, and the other kinds of knowing were waiting for the June morning, which gave the June morning a weight and a significance that I found, and still find, exactly right. Harold's Uncle Dwight died in 1962, 11 years after we married, of a stroke that was swift and absolute, and that left no time for the conversations that come when dying is slower. Harold grieved him genuinely. Dwight had been more father than uncle, had been the man who put his faith in Harold when Harold was young and unproven, and who had been right about what Harold was made of. The hardware store carried a plaque for many years, a small brass thing on the wall near the register that said in plain letters, "Dwight Marsh, who built this." Harold put it there the week after the funeral and it stayed there until we sold the store in 1978, and then Harold brought it home and put it in his workshop where it still is, in my basement where I leave it. Our first child was born on a March morning in 1952, a girl we named Catherine Ruth, and who arrived in the world with a dark cap of hair and a voice that the delivery room nurse described as impressive, which was the most restrained word available. I'd been in labour for 11 hours, which in those days you did largely alone. Harold was in the waiting room with the other fathers, all of them in the outside room being kept outside while the important business was conducted without them, which was in some ways practical and in other ways strange. The strangeness being that the most significant event of your marriage happened in a room your husband was not permitted to enter. When he came in, finally, and saw her, he had an expression on his face that I have tried to describe many times and never managed accurately. It was beyond the words for gladness. It was the expression of a man encountering something he had known was coming, and that had nonetheless managed to be entirely unexpected. The thing about young children that I could not have imagined before I had them is how completely they reorganize the interior world. Not only the practical arrangements, the sleeping schedule, or the not sleeping schedule, the meals, the endless logistics of a small human being who cannot do anything for themselves and needs you to do it and needs you now, but the way you hold yourself in your own life. Something shifts in the centre of gravity. Something becomes important that was not important before, and everything else readjusts around it in a way that is final and irreversible, and that you cannot prepare for because there is nothing to practice on. The first time Catherine cried in a way that told me she was in pain, a fever. She was about 4 months old, and the crying had a different quality from the hunger crying, and the tired crying, a sharper and more frightened quality. I felt something move through me that was purely animal, that bypassed thought entirely, and went straight to the place where the oldest responses live. I understood my mother's expression at the kitchen sink in a way I had not understood before. I understood it completely. We had Robert in 1955, and then Patricia in 1958. 3 children in 6 years, which produced in our small house on Elm Street a quality of noise and motion, an ongoing demand that I sometimes had to step back from, stepping out onto the back porch for 2 minutes, just 2 minutes, looking at the yard and the sky and the neighbour's fence and the sparrows in the forsythia, before going back in. I did not begrudge any of it. I want to be careful about that, because I think women of my generation are sometimes described as having been burdened by their domestic lives in a way that doesn't account for how much we wanted them, how much many of us genuinely chose them, imperfect as the choosing was in the constrained sense in which we chose. I wanted those children. I loved that house. I am not going to pretend otherwise in the service of a story about constraint that is true, but not the whole truth. But the complexity is also real. The complexity arrived for me through the doctors. The pediatricians. Let me tell you about the pediatricians. In the 1950s, the advice about how to raise children came primarily and authoritatively from medicine, which had decided during those years that it knew what children needed, and that what mothers thought children needed was less reliable, less scientific, less to be trusted. Dr. Spock's book was in half the houses in the country. We had a copy. It sat on my kitchen counter for the better part of a decade, and there were the actual physicians, Dr. Hennessy in our case, who you saw in their offices with their white coats and their authority, and what they told you was what you did. Because the whole culture had organised itself around the idea that expertise superseded experience, that the doctor's knowledge was more valid than the mother's, and that to defer to your own instincts was a form of ignorance. What they told us in those years was to follow the schedule. Feeding schedules, sleeping schedules, the organised, predictable, expert-designed schedule that would produce a healthy and well-regulated child if you simply adhered to it correctly. A baby should eat every 4 hours, not because the baby indicated hunger at 4-hour intervals, but because 4 hours was the schedule. If the baby cried at 2 hours and 45 minutes, you waited. You did not go to it immediately. You let it cry. The advice, and I remember this specifically, remember sitting in Dr. Hennessy's office with Catherine when she was 2 months old, and a nurse explaining to me in a voice of absolute professional certainty. The advice was that attending to a crying baby at every cry would spoil it, would teach it that the way to get what it wanted was to cry, which was not a lesson you wanted a child to learn. There is a logic to this advice. I can see the logic. I could see it then, which is part of what made it so difficult to navigate. Because the logic was real, but the advice was wrong, in a way that I felt in my body before I could articulate it in my mind. I was standing in the hallway outside Catherine's door at 2 a.m, listening to her cry. Not hungry. The clock said it was too soon. Not wet, I had checked. Just crying with that particular quality of a small person who needs the reassurance of presence. And everything in me said go to her. Everything in me said this child needs you to go to her right now. And instead I stood in the hallway with my hand on the door frame and waited for the 4 hours to complete because the doctor had said to wait. I followed this advice. I want to be honest about that. I followed it with Catherine and with Robert and with Patricia, because I was 21 and then 24 and then 27, and I was a young woman in the 1950s, and the 1950s had a very specific relationship between young women and the authority of medicine, which was that medicine was right and your body was sentimental. The sentiment had to be managed and overridden in the interest of the science. What no one said to me, what no one was saying in those years in that culture, was that my knowledge of my own child was also a form of knowledge, that the sensation I was experiencing in the hallway at 2 a.m. was information, not sentiment, was data about this specific child in this specific moment that no schedule produced in an office could replicate. The schedules were not the only piece of advice that felt wrong. There was the instruction about emotional displays, the caution against too much responsiveness, the warning that a mother who showed too much affect, who was too eager, too warm, too present, would produce a clingy, difficult, dependent child. Keep some distance, was the implication. Maintain your composure. Your child is not a friend. It is a project that requires management. I can hear how harsh that sounds, and I want to be fair to the doctors who gave this advice, who were working from the best theory available to them in the 1950s, from a reading of Freud and from a set of behaviourist studies that have since been substantially revised. They were not evil. They were not malicious. They were wrong in the specific and costly way that the partial knowledge of any era is always in retrospect wrong. What it asked of us, of the young mothers of that era, was to become strangers to our own knowing, to learn to distrust the signal at the level where the signal was clearest and most urgent. I think about this when I read, in the papers or the magazines, about what the research now says about early attachment, about what infants need, and how they communicate need, and what happens in their nervous systems when they communicate need and are and aren't responded to. The research now says things my body was saying in 1952 that I was trained to ignore. That is not a neutral fact. That has consequences. I cannot calculate what those consequences were for my particular children because I don't have the counterfactual. I don't know who Catherine and Robert and Patricia would have been if I had gone to them every time they cried instead of following the schedule. I only know who they became, which is people I am proud of and grateful for, people who are whole and loving and capable. So the damage, if there was damage, did not prevent the wholeness, but I believe the damage was real. I carried this for a long time as a private guilt, the particular guilt of a mother who suspects she did it wrong in a way she can't fully prove. It was only in my later years, as the research changed and the culture changed, and the women's movement said, among the many things it said, that the knowledge of women about their own experience is a form of knowledge and not a form of ignorance. It was only then that I could look back at that hallway and understand what had happened there, not as failure on my part, as the cost of living in a time that had not yet learned what it needed to learn. Alongside all of that, and I want to give this its full weight, the children were wonderful. Catherine at 2 with her dark, serious eyes taking in the world with a focus that seemed too large for a small person. Robert at 3, following Harold around on Saturday mornings with the same solemn apprenticeship Thomas had shown with my father, asking questions about everything and absorbing the answers with an attention that was moving to watch. Patricia, my youngest, who had a warmth from her very first weeks that felt particular to her alone. That was not my warmth or Harold's, but something that had arrived with her, a specific quality of open-heartedness that made people lean toward her in rooms, that made strangers smile at her on the street. Summer afternoons when all 3 were in the backyard and I could hear them from the kitchen while I was cooking or canning or doing the accounts. The particular sound of children playing, improvisational, layered, sometimes suddenly silent in a way that required attention, and then loud again with laughter. The sound of 3 specific children making their way through a Tuesday afternoon in Ohio, running through the sprinkler Harold rigged up from the hose in July, arguing over something whose stakes were enormous to them and incomprehensible to anyone over the age of 8. Those sounds are still in my ears. They will be in my ears, I think, until there is nothing left in my ears. Those were the beautiful ordinary days. I could not have called them that while I was living them. The present tense is too relentless and too continuous to be beautiful. It is only when it becomes the past that it can be seen as beautiful, the way you can see a mountain clearly only once you have descended from it. From here, from this chair, from the distance of all these years, I can see the shape of those days exactly, and the shape is good, and the shape contains, alongside the mistakes and the following of wrong advice and the nights in the hallway, a quantity of joy that is not diminished by anything. Not by anything. The neighbourhood on Elm Street in the 1950s was a particular kind of community that I think about sometimes with a feeling I have not quite found a word for. Something between nostalgia and analysis. The feeling of looking at something you were inside and trying to understand it from outside without entirely succeeding. The houses were close together, more close than farmhouses were, and you knew your neighbours in a daily way. You heard their conversations through the windows in summer. You helped the woman next door when she had her baby and her husband was away. You exchanged baked goods on the occasions when baking excess coincided with neighbourly opportunity. It was not the deep mutual dependence of the farm community I had grown up in, but it was something real, a web of small daily connections that made the street a place rather than just an address. Dr. Hennessy held office hours on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons in a brick building on Main Street that smelled of antiseptic, and the particular dusty smell of old waiting room magazines. and I saw him more than I wanted to in those years. 3 children generating their share of the ear infections and the fevers and the mysterious rashes that are the normal business of pediatric medicine. He was not an unkind man. He was professional and efficient, and he believed completely in what he told me, which is important to say. He was not cynical, not performing authority he didn't possess. He possessed it. He had been to medical school and read the literature and consulted with colleagues and arrived at the schedule and the advice about emotional management and the cautions about over-responsiveness through a genuine process of professional formation. The process had led him to wrong conclusions, but the process was real. The books I read about children in those years, Dr. Spock's first, which was gentler than it is sometimes remembered, but also others, the pamphlets from the Children's Bureau and the articles in the women's magazines, presented a consistent picture of the well-managed child, the child whose schedule was predictable and whose demands were met at the appropriate time and not before, the child who was developing correctly toward independence and emotional regulation. The picture was persuasive because it was consistent. Every source said the same thing in the same direction, which is one of the conditions under which wrong ideas become so completely accepted that to contradict them requires a kind of heroism that most people do not feel called to supply. I was not heroic about this. I was 21 and uncertain and grateful for the guidance, and I took it. What I want to tell you, if there is any young mother listening to this tonight, is the thing I wish someone had told me in 1952. Your knowledge of your child is knowledge, not sentiment, not instinct to be overcome, not the sentimental overreaction of an untrained woman to be corrected by someone who has studied it. Knowledge, the specific, embodied, continuously updated knowledge of one person who has been paying intense attention to another person, in all circumstances, around the clock, for every day since that person was born. No schedule and no training can replicate that knowledge. It is more specific and more current than anything a textbook can contain. Trust it alongside the other things you are told. Trust it perhaps more. Robert's childhood was different from Catherine's in ways that I think had partly to do with my own learning. I was less anxious with Robert. Not because he was easier. He was not easier. He had his own set of requirements that were nothing like Catherine's. But because I had 3 years of actual experience behind me by then, and experience in the raising of children is the one thing that the experts cannot give you. By Robert, I had begun to understand that most of the catastrophes I anticipated did not happen, that children were more resilient than the worried book suggested, that the work of a mother was less about getting it exactly right than about being reliably present in an approximately right way, and that approximately right done with consistency and love was sufficient for most children most of the time. Patricia, the youngest, arrived in the house in 1958 when Robert was 3 and Catherine was 6, and immediately made her presence known as someone who had a complete and fully formed self that she intended to express in full, which is the most generous way I can put the fact that Patricia as an infant had a great deal to say about her circumstances. She was not an easy baby. She was also, from the very beginning, the most openly affectionate of the 3, the one who climbed into your lap not because she needed comfort, but because she wanted contact, wanted the simple warmth of being held, which she seemed to understand as its own good thing, and not just a response to distress. I let her. By 1958, I had developed enough confidence in my own judgment to let Patricia tell me what she needed rather than consulting the schedule first. The evenings in that small house on Elm Street, and then the larger house on Maple after 1960, were the evenings of a family that was, in the aggregate, managing. There were good evenings and hard evenings and routine evenings that were neither especially good nor especially hard, just the evening, arriving at 6 o'clock with the supper to be made and the children to be bathed and the homework to be supervised, and the countless small administrative decisions of a household with 3 children and a husband who had been at the store since 8 in the morning. And there were also, every so often, the evenings that did not require anything. A Sunday evening in July with the windows open and the fan going and Harold reading in his chair, and the children in the backyard with the hose squealing and running in the long summer light. And those evenings were the ones I stored, carefully, in the place where the best things go. I want to speak more directly about the pediatricians and the books, about what it actually felt like in the body to follow advice that contradicted what the body was telling you, because I think this is the part that gets lost when we talk about those years in retrospect. The retrospect makes it sound like a simple question of authority versus instinct, expertise versus knowledge. But it was not a simple question when you were inside it. It was a question that arrived at 2 a.m. in the specific form of a small person who was crying and whom you desperately wanted to comfort, and whom you had been instructed by people with medical degrees not to go to immediately. You lay in bed and you counted. Dr. Hennessy said 5 minutes before you respond. You counted to 5 minutes, which is much longer in the dark listening to a baby than it is on a clock, and then you went in, and then you soothed, and then you put the child back down, and then you went back to bed, and 2 hours later the same thing happened again. What I felt in those moments, and I want to be precise about this, was not simply frustration or distress. It was a more complicated feeling, a feeling of being divided, of there being 2 of me in that hallway, the me who had received the medical instruction and believed in its authority and was trying to comply with it, and the me who knew my child, who could read the specific quality of Catherine's cry with an accuracy that no textbook could replicate, who understood from the sound and the timing and the context exactly what was needed, and was being told to override that understanding in the service of a larger developmental goal that she could not, at 2 years old, care about. The experience with Robert 3 years later was different because I was different. I had 3 years of daily evidence about Catherine, evidence that she had not been ruined by the occasions when I had overridden the schedule and picked her up, evidence that she was, by any measure, a secure and happy child, and this evidence had done something to the authority of the books, not destroyed it. I still read the books. I still took the advice. But I read it with a different quality of attention now, with the reading of someone who has her own dataset to compare against the dataset in the book, and when the book's recommendations came up against my own data, I did not automatically defer. The 4-hour feeding schedule was the one I broke first. Robert was 6 weeks old and had been crying for an hour and a half past his scheduled feeding time, and Dr. Hennessy's instructions were that the schedule must be maintained, that early feeding would confuse the digestive system and train the child to expect an irregular interval, and that the short-term distress of waiting was worth the long-term benefit of regularity. I stood in the kitchen with Robert in my arms, and I thought about this. I genuinely thought about it, and then I fed him. He was hungry. He ate. He was immediately content. And I thought, whatever the theory says, the evidence in front of me does not support it, and I'm going to trust the evidence in front of me. This sounds simple now. It was not simple then. I felt, feeding Robert before the schedule said to, the particular anxious guilt of someone who is doing something they have been specifically instructed not to do by someone whose authority they respect. I worried about the digestive confusion. I worried about the irregular interval. I was not fully confident in my own judgment. I was 24 and had been told repeatedly that professional expertise was more reliable than maternal instinct. But the worry was manageable, and the evidence was there in front of me, a satisfied baby who had been fed, and that evidence was more available to me in its specific materiality than the theoretical harm the schedule was meant to prevent. Patricia, 5 years after that, was the child I raised closest to my own instincts, and she is, of the 3, the one who has been most consistently at ease with herself, which I do not say as a causal claim because 1 child is not an experiment, and 3 children is not a sample, but I notice it. Catherine, my most schedule-managed baby, is the most anxious of my children, the most inclined to worry about doing things correctly, the most uncomfortable with uncertainty. Whether that is my doing or simply who Catherine is, I genuinely do not know. I've wondered about it for 70 years and I still don't know, and not knowing is the honest answer, which is the only answer I have. I did not discuss any of this with the other women on Elm Street, not directly. The Pediatricians' authority was so ambient in those years that to question it openly felt like a kind of confession, not of error but of inadequacy, of being the kind of woman who couldn't manage the proper schedule, who was too soft, too swayed by sentiment to do what was professionally recommended. We were all trying very hard to do it right, all of us on that street, all of us with our Dr. Spock copies and our pediatrician instructions and our genuine desire to raise our children well, and none of us, as far as I know, told the others when we deviated from the plan. The deviation was private. The plan was what we presented to each other. What I know now from the decades of reading that followed, from the attachment research of the 70s and 80s, from the work of people like John Bowlby, whose ideas about early bonding were so different from what I had been taught, from the general movement of pediatric advice away from scheduled management and toward responsiveness, is that my instinct was right. Not in the sense that I need vindication, not in that score-settling way, but in the sense that it is useful to know. The body knows things. The body of a mother holding her child knows things about that particular child in that particular moment that are worth listening to alongside everything else. They told us the listening was weakness. It was knowledge, different kinds, both real. If you're still with me, I am glad. We're about halfway through this evening together. Let yourself drift if you need to. I will still be here when you come back, or in the next evening if that is when you find me. There is always more. There is a decade or so in most lives if you are fortunate and the larger forces of the world cooperate, when things feel solid. The children are old enough to have stopped requiring constant management, and young enough that they are still at home, still part of the daily weave of the household, still at the table for supper most nights. The marriage has settled into itself, has found its particular rhythms and accommodations, has become something so familiar that you sometimes forget to appreciate it the way you forget to appreciate the floor underfoot, which supports you every moment, and which you notice only when it is no longer there. The work is established and known. The house is yours in the way that only years of living inside something can make it yours in your bones. I had that decade, roughly from the early 1960s to the early 70s, and I want to say something careful and true about it because I think it is the decade most easily misunderstood from the outside. What I want to say is that I underestimated it while I was living it. I thought it was a resting place. I thought the years of real significance were the ones that had come before, the years of becoming someone, of marrying, of having children, of the large arrangements of a life, and the ones that would come after, the years of whatever came next, the undetermined future. I thought this middle period was a pause between importances. I was wrong about this in a fundamental way. Those years were not a pause. They were the architecture. They were the structure inside which everything else, everything that had come before and everything that would come after, had its context and its meaning. But you cannot see architecture from inside it. You can only see the rooms. Harold took over the hardware store from his Uncle Dwight in 1957, bought it formally with a bank loan and a smaller loan from my father that was never spoken of as a loan between any of the parties involved, but that my father and I both knew was one, and that Harold repaid quietly and completely over the next 5 years without anyone making a ceremony of it. The store became his in the full sense, his name on the door, his decisions in the ordering and the hiring and the pricing, and he was good at it in the way he was good at everything he gave his full attention to, which was by paying attention in the ongoing way, not dramatically but consistently, day after day, so that over time his knowledge of what the store needed and what its customers needed became very deep. The store was a kind of institution in Millbrook, the way certain businesses become institutions in small towns. Not just a place to buy things, but a place where information moved and where the social texture of the town was maintained, where men came on Saturday mornings to stand among the bins of bolts and the paint sections and the hanging tools and to talk about the things that men talked about in those years, the weather and the crops and the sports teams and the local news and the national news, which was increasingly complicated in the 1960s in ways that were difficult to discuss standing in a hardware store, but that people discussed anyway, because you had to talk about it somewhere. Harold could hold his own in those conversations on any topic, which was one of his gifts, the ability to be present to whoever was in front of him and to what they were concerned about. I worked in the store on afternoons doing the books and the ordering, while the children were in school. This was Harold's idea initially. He needed help with the accounting, and I was better at it than he was, which he acknowledged without difficulty because he was not the kind of man who found it threatening to be better at some things than he was. I liked the work in the way I had liked the grain elevator work before the children came, liked the precision of it, liked being in a place that had its own established requirements and systems, liked, too, being outside the house for several hours a day, which I understood as important to me in a way that I would not have been able to articulate in 1962, but that I understand very clearly now. Catherine graduated from high school in 1970 and enrolled at Ohio State, which was an event in our family that I want you to understand the weight of correctly. It was not remarkable by the standard of 1970, when a fair number of young women were going to university, but it was remarkable by the standard of our family's history, which contained no one who had done it before her. My parents had not gone. Harold's parents had not gone. I had not gone, and Catherine was going to Ohio State and Columbus with a partial scholarship and a summer of earnings from the ice cream shop on Main Street. And the day Harold and I drove her down and helped her carry her things up 3 flights of stairs to her dormitory room and then drove home, I sat in the passenger seat of the car for the whole 4 hours without saying very much, looking out the window at the Ohio countryside going past, thinking about things I didn't have the words for. Robert was a steady boy, a steady young man, who did well in school without drama about it, and who had from early on a quality of self-possession that I associated with Harold. The ability to be in a room without needing to take it over, without needing it to organise itself around him. He graduated in 1973 and worked for 2 years at the county extension office, which was useful work and which suited him, before going back to school for an agricultural degree in Columbus, which is where he met Susan. Patricia was the complicated one, and I say that with the deepest affection, the kind of affection that is possible only after you have been through something with someone and come out the other side. She was bright and funny and intensely loyal to the people she loved, and she had, from her early adolescence, a particular way of feeling things too fully for the container she had, a way of experiencing the ordinary disappointments and frustrations and confusions of growing up as though they were larger than they were, which I believe now was something real in her neurology and not a character failing. In the 1960s and early 70s, we did not have the vocabulary for what Patricia was, did not have the framework, and so what we had was a girl in distress that I could not fully account for and could not fully reach. The years of her middle adolescence, her 15th and 16th and 17th year, were difficult. Not in the way of dramatic events. There was nothing catastrophic, and I am grateful for that. But in the way of sustained worry, the ongoing low-grade alarm of a mother who knows her child is struggling and cannot find the right way to help, and must try anyway. I tried. Harold tried. We tried separately and together. We found a doctor who seemed to understand Patricia better than Dr. Hennessy had understood her, who talked to her in a way she was willing to be talked to. Progress was slow and not linear, and there were evenings when I went to bed not knowing what the next day would bring. What I gave Patricia in those years, as consistently as I could, was exactly one thing: the house. Not speeches or strategies or corrections, but the house. The same house in the same condition, with the same lamp on, and the same supper on the table, and the same mother in the same chair willing to listen to whatever she brought home and not requiring her to be more than she was on any given day. Whether that helped her, I cannot say with certainty. She might tell you something different. But I believe that consistency, when everything else is uncertain, is its own form of love, and that love, absorbed over years even when it cannot be received consciously, makes its way in. The 1960s brought changes to the country that came to Millbrook at a certain remove and a certain delay, the way changes always reach small towns. Not immediately, not with the same intensity, but real and eventually unavoidable. The civil rights movement was reported on the radio and then the television, and I sat with my children and watched the footage that came in from the South, and felt things I did not know how to fit into the picture I had of my country, a country I had always believed was, if imperfect, fundamentally decent, and the footage was asking me to revise that belief in ways I was not always sure how to do. Harold and I talked about it. Not as much as we should have, probably. We were people of our time and place, which is both an explanation and not quite an excuse, and I have tried to hold both of those truths at once. The hardware store was sold in 1978, after Harold's uncle Dwight died and the estate was settled, and it became clear that Harold could either buy out the remaining interest or sell the whole thing, and Harold was 52 and had been having some health concerns that he was managing quietly, the way he managed everything, by doing what was required and not dramatising the doing of it, and we decided together, over the kitchen table, that selling was the right thing. The store had been the centre of Harold's working life for over 30 years, had been the institution and the income and the thing his name was on, and selling it was a loss that he accepted with the steadiness he brought to everything but that I watched cost him something, and that I tried to acknowledge without naming it, which was what he preferred. Those settled years contained their unsettled passages, as I have said, and I don't want to give you the impression that they were uniformly placid or uniformly good. But what I keep coming back to, when I think about that period of my life, is the specific texture of the ordinary days, the Tuesday afternoons, the Saturday mornings, the long Sunday afternoons in summer when the screen door banged and the children argued in the yard, and the smell of whatever was in the kitchen oven drifted through the house, and Harold was in his chair with a paper, and everything was for those hours simply and completely itself. Those hours were the life, not the events, not the dramas, not the difficult passages or the proud moments. The ordinary hours were the life, and they were good, and I was in them. Harold and I had in those years something that I think is rare in marriages, and that I value more the further I get from it: a genuine friendship. We liked each other. We were interested in each other's thinking. We argued about things, about politics, which was something we disagreed about in some of the ways that two people from similar backgrounds can still disagree, about what Catherine should study at Ohio State, about whether to repaint the house green or stay with white. And the arguing was not combat, but the thing that arguments are when two people respect each other's intelligence, which is a form of mutual engagement, a way of thinking together that is more productive than thinking separately. I had, in the mid-1960s, a period of about 2 years where I wanted something I couldn't quite name. I was not unhappy, not in any particular or definable way. Harold was well, and the store was doing fine, and the children were in school, and the house was in order. But I had a feeling that I recognized from the girl on the porch in Ohio who had looked at the horizon and felt the pull of something she couldn't name. I had that feeling again, in my mid-30s, and this time I could name it a little better. I wanted work. Not the work of the household or the part-time work at the store. I wanted something that was mine, that had my name on it, that was produced by my thinking and my effort, and that went somewhere, that had a destination outside the house. I took a bookkeeping class at the community centre. That sounds modest, and it was modest, but it was something, it was mine. And the woman who taught it, a Mrs. Dorothy Marsh, who was no relation to Harold's family, turned out to have a mind I found immediately interesting, and a directness that I had associated since Loretta Haynes with the most trustworthy people. We became friends, Dorothy and I, and that friendship, the friendship of two women who met in a bookkeeping class and discovered they had more in common than bookkeeping, was one of the gifts of that decade, one of the things I did not expect and was grateful for. The 60s changed things, as decades are obligated to do. The television came into most houses, ours included, in the late 50s, and the television changed how the news arrived, changed the texture of the public world as it came into the private one. You could see it. The sit-ins at the lunch counters, the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, the face of Dr. King. These were not things you could understand at a comfortable remove once you had seen them, once the camera had placed you there. I sat in my living room in Millbrook, Ohio, and watched things that made the comfortable remove impossible, and I had to decide what to do with that, which is never a simple decision, and which I did not make perfectly. The hardware store in the late 60s had its own modest engagement with the culture of the times. Young men came in with their hair longer than Harold's generation had worn it, and Harold sold them what they needed: paint for their houses, tools for their projects, plumbing supplies for the places they were living, without comment on their hair or their politics. This was its own kind of statement, though Harold would not have called it that. He would have said he was just running a hardware store, which was both true and, given the times, more than it sounds. The grandchildren, the first ones from Robert and Susan, who married in 1977, arrived in the early 1980s, and with them arrived a reorganization of my sense of my own life that I had not anticipated. A grandchild is a different thing than a child, in the specific way that distance changes the quality of an attachment without diminishing it. You love them fully and without the weight of daily responsibility, which is the luxury of it, the particular pleasure of the grandparental position, and you can be with them in a way that is entirely about them, not managed by schedule or necessity, just freely given and freely received. My first grandchild, Robert's son William, was born in 1982, and I held him in the hospital the day after he was born and did not put him down until someone insisted, and I thought, this is what I should have been, with mine. This present, this unhurried. Harold sold the hardware store in 1978, which was a decision that took 2 years to arrive at and about 20 minutes to execute. The offer came from a man named Dale Fenter, who had been watching the store for a while, in the way that people watch something they intend to buy, with a quality of attention that is not quite casual, and that Harold recognized. He came home one evening and told me Dale Fenter had made an offer, and that he was going to take it, and I asked him how he felt about that, and he said he felt like a man who had done the thing he set out to do, and was ready to do something else, and that was true. And I recognized it as true because I had watched him for the previous year developing a certain weariness, with the business that was different from the ordinary tiredness of a long day. It was a weariness with the repetition of it, with the dailiness of it, with the thing that a business is after 20 years. The same questions and the same answers, and the same accounts, and the same relationships cycling through in slightly different configurations. What Harold did after he sold the store was a surprise to me, and I knew him as well as I have ever known anyone. He started a kitchen garden, not a small one, a serious one, behind the house on Maple Street, in the space that had been lawn and that Harold spent a week turning over with a spade before the first planting, working with the concentration and the patience that he had always given to the things he cared about. He grew tomatoes and beans and squash, and in a separate raised bed, herbs, and in the fall he grew pumpkins, which he distributed to the grandchildren with great ceremony. He was 60 years old, and he had sold his business, and what he wanted to do with the time he had reclaimed was to put his hands in the earth and grow things. I found this so completely right that I did not know how to tell him, so I simply helped, which was my way of telling him. The years between Harold selling the store in 1978 and Harold dying in 1991 were among the best of our married life, and I say this knowing that it is a surprising thing to say, that most people would expect the young years to be the best, the young family years on Elm Street with the children small and everything happening quickly and the future all in front of us. Those years were good, but the years after 1978 were good in a different way. Good in the way that things are good when the main work is done, and what remains is the presence, the being together without the organising purpose of the store or the children's daily needs. We had time, we used it. We read in the evenings, we watched the news and argued about it. We drove to Columbus for the symphony twice a year. We went to see Robert and Susan in Cleveland, Catherine and her family in Cincinnati, Patricia on the one trip west we made together in 1985 that remains one of the great adventures of my life. 3 weeks in a rented car, Harold driving, me navigating, both of us astonished by how large the country was and how completely it exceeded every picture we had formed of it from the descriptions and the photographs. Harold died in January of 1991. He was 63 years old. We had been married for 39 years, 8 months, and some number of days that I have never calculated, because it seemed like the kind of counting that leads somewhere you don't want to go, into the arithmetic of absence rather than the memory of presence. He died in a hospital in Columbus, in a room with a window that looked out onto a parking structure, which is not a thing you choose and not the thing you focus on when you're sitting beside someone in a hospital bed at 4 a.m, but which I have nonetheless remembered. The particular grey geometry of that parking structure against the particular grey of a January sky, because the mind keeps what it keeps without consulting you. I held his hand. I want to say that because it matters to me that I was there, that I did not miss that moment, that it was something I was present for. He was not conscious, not by the end, not in the way you are conscious when you can acknowledge someone's presence. But I was there. The room was quiet in the way hospital rooms are quiet at 4 a.m, a muffled institutional quiet with the sounds of the building underneath it, the hum of the ventilation system, the distant footsteps of the overnight staff, the particular quality of a large building maintaining itself while the people inside it are as still as they will be until morning. I sat with him and held his hand, and at some point the quality of his breathing changed, and then the breathing stopped, and then there was the different kind of quiet. I'm not going to dwell on the days immediately after. They belong to a category of experience that is too immediate and too raw to serve well as company to fall asleep to, and I promised you something gentle tonight. What I will say is that grief, in my experience, the grief of losing a person you have built a life with, that has been the architecture of your daily existence for 39 years, is nothing like the stories about grief. It is not dramatic, or not mostly. It is small and domestic. It is the 2-cup coffee pot that you have no reason to replace, but that seems suddenly to comment on your situation every morning. It is reaching across the bed in the night to the side, where someone was for 39 years and finding no one. Oh. It is the Sunday afternoon that arrives with all its ordinary weight and no Harold in it, and you sit in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the Sunday paper that you have never actually read because it was always Harold who read the Sunday paper and passed you the sections he thought you'd want, and you sit there and you read the whole thing, every section, because you do not know what else to do with a Sunday afternoon. My mother told me the most useful thing anyone told me in those years. She was 81 and still driving, still herself, still the person who could produce a loaf of bread from the kitchen of the house on Route 12 while conducting a conversation about the weather and the cost of electricity and the behaviour of her neighbour's dog all simultaneously, without losing track of any of them. She came to see me about 2 weeks after Harold died, and we sat at my kitchen table, which is where we always sat for the serious conversations, and she let me talk for a long time, the specific listening of a person who has learned to receive what is being said rather than organise a response to it. And when I was finished, she said, "You don't stop missing them. You just get bigger around the missing. There is more of you eventually, and the missing is the same size it always was, so it takes up less." I have returned to that image many times in the years since. It is the most accurate description I know of how grief actually works if you don't fight it. I kept going because that is the honest answer to how you keep going. You keep going. There is a life in place and it requires your continued appearance in it. The children called and came. Catherine drove up from Cincinnati within 2 days of Harold's death and stayed for a week, managing things in the way Catherine manages things, which is with a completeness that leaves you nothing to do, which can feel both like rescue and like occupation, but which I was too grateful for to examine too closely. Robert and Susan came. Patricia flew in from Portland, and then they went home, to their lives, to their own children and their own Tuesdays, and I was in the house on Maple Street alone for the first time in my life, in the full sense of the word. No Harold, no children at home, no mother down the road, just the house and me and the 2-cup coffee pot. The hardware store required attention and then was sold. Robert helped with the sale, spent several weeks in Millbrook managing the process with the same steadiness and competence Harold had always said Robert had, and I watched my son doing the things I had watched my husband do, and felt a complicated pride and sorrow simultaneously that I don't have a single word for in English, though I suspect one exists somewhere. The sale was fair, and the money was sufficient, and afterward I had the practical security that Harold had always wanted me to have, which was one of the things his steadiness had been building toward, the long patient building of a man who intends to be worth something to the people he loves. My mother died in 1993. She had been slowing down for a year, not in her mind, not in the clarity of her thinking, which remained as sharp as ever, but in the body, which had been working continuously for 82 years, and was entitled to its slowing. She died in her own bed, in the house on Route 12, which was what she had always said she wanted, and she got it, and I was there, as I had been there for Harold, and I held her hand, and there was the same quality of being present at the end of something enormous, the same complicated combination of grief and gratitude and the specific exhaustion of vigil. She was my mother. I have no better way of saying what that means except that she was in the category of the irreplaceable, and when she was gone, the category was empty. After my mother, I became, slowly and not always gracefully, someone who had fewer people above her in the order of things. I had always been someone's child. Now I was not. I was the generation standing at the front of the line, with no one ahead of me and only my own children behind me, and that position had a quality of exposure that I had not anticipated, and that I never entirely adjusted to, though I adjusted sufficiently to continue. This is a thing I know now, and wish I had known earlier. The position of being the elder, the one who knows the most about the longest span of a family's life, carries a weight that you cannot prepare for. It is the weight of being the memory, the keeper of the stories, the last one who knew certain people in certain ways. You carry the dead with you in a particular way when you are the eldest. They are not separate from you. They are part of your weight. In the late 1990s, my friend Loretta, who had remained in my life in the way that some friendships remain, through the regular letters and then the occasional calls, and one visit in 1978 when we sat at her kitchen table in Dayton and talked for 6 hours and recovered the friendship entire, like rediscovering a room in a house you thought you knew completely. Loretta began to disappear. Not from the world yet, but from herself, in the incremental way of dementia, which takes people in a direction that is neither away from you nor toward you, but sideways into something that is not quite either the person you knew or a different person, but some third thing that requires a different kind of relationship than the one you had. I visited her twice in those last years. The first visit I talked to her, and she knew me, though the knowing came and went and there were long stretches where she was somewhere else, somewhere I couldn't follow. The second visit she was mostly gone. I drove home from Dayton on that second occasion and sat in my car in the driveway of my house in Millbrook for a long time before going inside. Not crying, just sitting with the weight of it, the particular weight of losing someone to something that moves slowly and does not have the decency of being over. My brother Thomas died in 1999 in the farmhouse outside Athens where he had lived with his wife since 1953. He was the most like my father of the four of us, the most laconic, the most patient, the most completely at home in physical work, and he died the way he had lived, quietly, without making a great deal of fuss about it. James had died earlier, in 1987, from a heart that had given trouble since his 40s, and Ruth outlasted them both, living to 87 in Columbus in an apartment near her daughter, Ruth, who had always been going somewhere arriving at the end of her life, in a small apartment in the city she had been heading for since she was 12 years old, and dying there content, or as content as Ruth was capable of being, which was in her own way quite content indeed. Loss accumulates. I will not soften that or find a more palatable way to say it, because you are old enough, most of you, to know it already. It accumulates in the way that sediment accumulates, gradually, patiently, by increment, until one day you look around and you're standing in something deep. But what accumulates alongside it, what my mother promised me would, and what has in fact, is capacity. The capacity to carry it, the capacity to make room for it, without letting it fill the room entirely, the capacity to be a person who has lost people, and who is still here, still in the room, still in this chair, with the lamp on and the rain outside, and more life in this evening than the loss can account for. That is how you carry it and keep going. You get bigger, not harder, bigger. Big enough that the weight, which is real and which does not diminish, becomes something you can bear, and bearing it becomes something you are, and being that becomes its own kind of life, a life made substantial by everything it has held. The years immediately following Harold's death had a particular texture that I want to describe more carefully, because I think the description of widowhood that you get from the outside is rarely accurate to the experience from the inside. From the outside it looks like grief and loss and emptiness, which are real, but which do not account for other things that are also real. A freedom that arrives alongside the grief, and that you feel guilty about feeling, the freedom of being, for the first time in 39 years, entirely responsible for your own days and no one else's. The freedom to eat supper at 5 if you want to, or at 9. The freedom to go to bed immediately after supper and read for 3 hours without anyone noting the eccentric schedule. The freedom of silence, which Harold's presence had never exactly prevented, but which had always been a shared silence, and which now was entirely yours. Dorothy Marsh, my friend from the bookkeeping class, was the person who helped me most in the first year after Harold died, not by doing things for me, but by being available and being honest. She had been widowed herself 3 years earlier, and she told me true things about what the experience was like without softening them into reassurance, which was exactly what I needed. She told me that the first year was the hardest, and that the second year was different in ways that were hard to predict, and that the third year you began to understand something about yourself that you had not understood before. She was right about all of it. She had a quality of accuracy about experience that I found more useful than comfort in those years. The children, in the years after Harold died, showed me things about themselves that I had not seen before, or had seen but not fully registered. Catherine, who had been the one I worried about least because she was so clearly capable and so clearly in charge of her own life, showed herself to be the one who felt my situation most acutely, who drove up from Cincinnati most often, who called most frequently, who had a quality of fierce protectiveness toward me that was both touching and occasionally overwhelming. Robert, the quiet one, showed himself to be the one I could call when I was having a genuinely hard day, the one I could say I am not doing well to without needing to explain further or have a plan for it. Patricia, from Portland, showed herself in her letters and her calls to be the one who understood the specific quality of what I was feeling in a way that surprised me, as though the distance had given her a clarity about me that the closer ones didn't have. I became, in the years after Harold died, a person who walked more than I had before. This was partly the doctor's advice and partly necessity, and partly something I discovered by accident and then made into practice. That walking, in the specific physical fact of it, the steady one foot then the other, the forward motion through the world at the pace the world was made for, helped the thinking that was otherwise going around in circles in the chair. I walked in the mornings, after coffee for 45 minutes or an hour, through the neighbourhood and then on the trail by the creek, and the walks were where I sorted things, where I let the previous day's unprocessed material find its way to some provisional resting place. Millbrook had changed in those years. The downtown had thinned, the way downtowns of small Ohio towns thinned in the 80s and 90s, as the commerce went to the mall outside of town and then to the catalogue and then to the internet. The hardware store, under its new owners after we sold it, had lasted another decade before closing. Horton's general store had closed years before that. The barbershop where Harold had his hair cut every 3 weeks for 30 years had closed. The diner where we had gone on Saturday mornings when the children were small had closed. What remained was a town that was still itself, still Millbrook, still recognisable, but with gaps in it like missing teeth, the spaces where things had been and weren't anymore, giving the whole a slightly different shape. I did not find this depressing. That surprises people when I say it, but it doesn't surprise me. I had grown up watching things change. The farm, the downtown, the nature of the work people did and how they lived. And I had come to understand change not as loss, but as the ongoing nature of things, the way the world remains the world while the specific arrangements within it shift. The creek was still there, the water tower was still there, the church was still there, repainted once, the congregation smaller but still gathered. First Methodist still rang its bell on Sunday mornings, and I could hear it from my kitchen if the windows were open. Some things hold. You learn, over a long life, which things those are, and you put your faith in those rather than in the ones that change. James died in 1987, 4 years before Harold, and the death of a younger sibling is a thing that reorganises your understanding of the order of things in a way that the death of an older person does not. Thomas I had expected. Not soon, not when he died, but in the abstract I had understood that Thomas was the oldest, and would likely go first among us. James was the youngest. James was my brother, who had been 12 years old in 1949, who had collected arrowheads from the creek bed, and who had a laugh you could hear from 2 houses away, and who had moved to Cincinnati in 1962, and built a life there in machine repair, which suited him, which was always the kind of work that suited James, taking broken things apart and making them whole again. He died of a heart attack at 59, which is very young from where I am sitting, though it was not so obviously young then. Grief is not linear. I knew this before I had much occasion to practice it, had known it intellectually from the losses I witnessed in others, but the knowing is different from the living. The living of grief goes like this. There are the days when it is the entire weather of you, when everything else is subordinate to it, when you move through the day carrying it, and the carrying is the primary fact of the day. And then there are the days when it is not the primary weather, when the business of the day predominates, when you go an entire morning without thinking of the person who is gone, and then you think of them, and the thinking has a specific quality of surprise in it, the surprise of finding them gone again at the moment you thought of them, and the surprise is its own small grief layered on top of the main one. What helps, and what I have told people who have asked me, because when you are old, people ask you about loss, as though longevity implies expertise, which is not entirely wrong. What helps is not the consolations. The consolations are well meant, and I received them, and I am grateful for the intention behind them. What actually helps is time and activity and the company of people who do not require you to be fine. Those 3 things. Time, because grief requires duration to do its work and there is no shortcut. Activity, because the body going through its ordinary motions keeps the mind from the circling that is grief's worst feature. And the company of specific people who do not require you to present a particular face to them, who will sit with you in the kitchen while you are not fine and not make an occasion of it. I want to say something about Harold's dying that I have not said to my children, not directly, because there are things that belong between a husband and a wife, and that do not need to become family history. In the last weeks, when he was very sick and he knew what the sickness was going to do, we had conversations that we had not had before, conversations about what had mattered and what we wished we had done differently and what we were glad of. Harold was not in general a man who talked about feelings. He was of a generation and a temperament that expressed emotion primarily through action, through being present and being steady and doing what was needed. But in those last weeks he talked, and what he said was this, that the best thing had been the ordinary, that the hardware store and the children and the Sunday dinners and the evenings in the sitting room were the whole of it, and that there was nothing he would go back for, no grander version of the life that had been missed. He was satisfied. He was at 63 facing what he was facing, satisfied with the life he had had. That is not a small thing. That is the thing. My mother died in 1993, 2 years after Harold, and I was with her when she died, which was in her own house in Millbrook, in her own bed, in the room she had slept in for 50 years. She died as she had lived, without drama, without complaint, with a quality of acceptance that was entirely her. She was 87, and she was tired, and she was ready, and she told me she was ready in those words, which was as direct as my mother ever was about anything. I held her hand, and the room was quiet, and the afternoon light came through the curtains she had made in 1961, and never replaced because they still worked, and she let go. That is the word for it. She let go. And the room continued to be the room, and the light continued to be the light, and the curtains continued to be the curtains, and she was not in it any more, and all of those ordinary things were still there, continuing without her. I've been to enough funerals in my long life to have opinions about funerals, which I will share only briefly. A good funeral is one where the people who loved the person are given time and space to say the true things about who the person was and what they meant, and where the ceremony is of a scale proportionate to the person's actual life, rather than to some idealized version of what a life should have been. My mother's funeral was like that. The church was not full. She had outlived most of her contemporaries, but the people who were there were the people who had known her, and the things that were said about her were true, and the minister who spoke had known her for 30 years and had earned the right to speak about her. I found this more comforting than I expected to. The true things said well, in a room full of people who knew they were true, is its own kind of ceremony, its own kind of consolation. Somewhere in my mid-70s the quality of time changed. Not the quantity. Time still proceeds at its 1 second per second, as indifferent to my preferences as it has always been. But the quality, the texture of it, the way it feels to be inside a day. When you're 35 with 3 children and a household and a job, you are fitting into the margins of everything else. The days happen to you. They come at you continuously and with their own momentum, and you move through them at the pace they set, and they are never quite over before the next one begins. When you're 75 and living in a house you have arranged entirely to your own specifications, answering to no schedule but your own, the days become available rather than relentless. You can sit in them. You can choose what to give your attention to. This is, I have found, a specific and underrated pleasure of late age. What I gave my attention to in those years was small things. The particular quality of winter light on a Tuesday afternoon in November, which I have been noticing all my life and which still surprises me, still has that grey-gold specificity that makes November Tuesday afternoons unlike anything else, even after 90 of them. The oak tree in the backyard, which I have watched from the kitchen window for 40 years, and which I had never really seen until I had time to see it. The birds, I became, in my mid-70s, a person who notices birds in the way that I had never been before, who can tell a white-throated sparrow from a white-crowned sparrow by the sound alone, and who finds this interesting and who does not require it to be interesting to anyone else. The cardinals in the snow. I will say that clearly. The cardinals in the snow in the forsythia by the kitchen window, red against white, are among the most reliable and most quietly spectacular things I know, and I see them now in a way I could not when I was busy enough that beautiful things had to compete for my attention. I took up reading in a different way than I had read before. I'd always read all my life. It is the thread that connects every version of me from the 8-year-old in the library to the 91-year-old in this chair. But now I read slowly, which is something age gives you. Slow reading is different from fast reading in ways that I cannot describe without sounding precious, but I will try. It is the difference between driving through a landscape and walking through it. The same landscape registered differently. When you read slowly, you stop and look. You go back. You let a sentence sit in your mind for a moment before moving on to the next one, and you find that sentences have more in them when you treat them that way. I reread things I had read when I was young and found them transformed. Little Women, which I first read at 8 in my mother's kitchen, I read again at 78 in my own kitchen, and I cried at the end in a way I had not cried the first time. I knew what was coming. I had known for 70 years. And I cried anyway, not for what happened in the story, but for the distance between the girl who read it the first time and the old woman reading it now, and for the strange persistence of the emotions the book evoked, which had changed in character over the decades but had not diminished. Some books stay with you by becoming new each time. Those are the ones worth keeping. The things I understand now that I did not understand then. I'm going to try to say some of them, not as instruction. I'm deeply suspicious of old people who dispense wisdom, as though age is a credential for it, which it isn't, but as observation, as the things I see from here that were not visible from closer in. I understand now that the instincts I was trained to distrust in my early years as a mother were real and were knowledge. That standing in the hallway at 2 a.m. with every signal in my body saying go to her, and overriding that signal in favour of a schedule, was not the exercise of good maternal judgment, but the override of it. That the knowledge held in a body, in the nervous system's reading of another nervous system, is as valid as the knowledge held in books, and that to be systematically educated away from it is to be impoverished in a specific and lasting way. I could not have said this in 1952. I could not even have thought it clearly, because the culture I was in had so thoroughly organised itself around the authority of professional expertise that to question it would have felt like questioning reading, or arithmetic, or the germ theory of disease. It would have felt like unreason. Now it feels like the simplest possible truth. I knew my child. The schedule did not know my child, and I should have trusted what I knew. I understand now that most of the things I was afraid would happen, the imagined catastrophes that populated the 4 a.m. part of various nights across my life, did not happen. Not the career failures, not the terrible illnesses, not the collapses of marriages or the estrangements I feared in my more anxious moments with the children. Some things happened that I had not imagined or expected or feared, because that is the nature of the things that actually happen. They are rarely the things on your worry list. They are the things that weren't on the list, the ones you hadn't thought to dread. But the catalogue of anticipated disasters, mostly not. This is a fact I've tried to remember in the worry I still experience, though it is harder to apply in real time than it sounds. The 4 a.m. part of the night is not a reasonable time. I understand now that I was kinder to the younger Eleanor in retrospect than I was in the moment. The mother I was, the wife I was, the daughter I was to 2 aging parents who needed things I was not always able to give. She is more forgiving in the rearview mirror. In real time, I was frequently certain I was doing it wrong, that some other woman in my position would have navigated it with more grace and less friction. Now I think that other woman was mostly fictional. The actual women I knew, the ones I could compare myself to honestly, were also doing it approximately right and approximately wrong, in their own ways, finding their own particular failures and their own particular successes, which looked different from mine but were not so different in their texture. I understand now that loneliness and solitude are genuinely different things, and that I was confused about which was which for a long time. I was lonely in some of the fullest periods of my life, in the years when the house contained 4 people at all times and was rarely quiet, in the years when I was most visibly embedded in a family and a community and a town. I was sometimes lonely in ways that the fullness made more rather than less acute. The loneliness of feeling that no one was quite seeing you as you actually were. And I have had solitude in these quiet years that has been not lonely at all but spacious. Like a room that contains exactly what belongs in it, and no more. This is not a simple lesson. I could not have simply decided to feel it differently before I had lived enough to feel it differently. But it is true, and it is one of the more useful truths I have learned. I understand now that the relationship between a mother and her daughters is not a fixed thing, but a changing one, and that the changes are generally towards something better if you have the patience to let them arrive. Catherine and I, who were similar enough in temperament to generate real friction in the years when she was becoming herself and needed to push against what I represented, arrived in her 40s and my 60s at a friendship that I value among the best of my life. The friction turned out to have been necessary. The pushing was the work of her becoming herself completely, and I was the available surface to push against. And now that she is fully herself and I am fully myself, and there is nothing to negotiate about authority or difference, we can simply be 2 women who love each other and find each other interesting, which is, I have concluded, the best possible outcome for a mother and daughter. I understand now that the body has its own knowledge, and that this knowledge deserves more respect than I gave it in the years when I was most thoroughly embedded in a culture that trusted expertise over embodied knowing. Not in medicine only, in many areas. The signal that said this is wrong, the signal that said something matters here that isn't being said, the signal that said slow down or pay attention or go back, those signals were right more often than I acted on them. I do not know what I would have done differently if I had trusted them more fully, but I know I am on the side of the signals now, and that any young woman who asks my opinion on the subject will get that answer. I understand now that the ordinary days were not the time between the significant days. They were the significant days. The Tuesday in February when nothing happened except that I made bread, and Robert was home sick from school and sat in the kitchen wrapped in a quilt, and we talked, him and me, for most of the afternoon about nothing in particular. That day is with me still. The Saturday morning when Harold and I drove out into the countryside for no reason, just drove, with the windows down in October, and the leaves going past and the radio on, and neither of us saying much, just existing in the same moving space on the same autumn Saturday. That morning is with me still. These are the days that made a life. These are the days I have. I am 91 years old, which is more years than I ever expected to have, more than the arithmetic of my generation promised. I am grateful for the surplus. I am grateful for the 20 years beyond my husband's life that have been mine to spend entirely as I wished, which has turned out to mean reading books slowly and watching cardinals in the snow and having long conversations with my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, who are a wonder to me in every direction. The ways they resemble the people who came before them, and the ways they are entirely new, entirely their own time, entirely something I could not have imagined in 1931 on a farm outside Millbrook, Ohio, which is where I started and which I carry with me still. My great-grandchildren, I should tell you about them, because they are what a long life accumulates in its finest form. There are 12 of them now, scattered from Cincinnati to Portland to Seattle, ranging in age from 5 months to 22 years. They call me Grandma Ellie, which is a name that arrived with the first one, Catherine's granddaughter, who could not manage Eleanor, and that I have accepted as the name for this particular version of myself, the very old one, the one at the end of the line who remembers things that happened before their parents were born. What surprises me about them, or still surprises me, though I have been watching them for long enough that it should not, is how much they are of their own time, and how much they are continuous with every person who came before them. My great-granddaughter Maya, who is 22 and studying something called data science at a university in Columbus, has her great-grandmother Vivian's way of organising information in her head faster than anyone else in the room can organise it on paper. She doesn't know this. There is no way to tell her that the particular quality of her intelligence is something I have seen before, something I recognise from a farmhouse kitchen in 1937, where her great-great-grandmother was calculating the quarterly accounts in her head while listening to the radio and making bread. But it is there. It is continuous. The world they are living in is so different from the world I was born into that I sometimes have difficulty believing they are the same world, and sometimes have difficulty believing I am the same person who was in both. I was born in a farmhouse with no telephone, into a family that heated with wood and lit with kerosene when the electricity went out, which it did regularly. My great-grandchildren have been in a world of smartphones and streaming, and the internet, a world where the question of what you want to know is answered within seconds, a world of connection so continuous and so comprehensive that the silence I grew up inside, the silence of a farmhouse in Ohio on a winter evening in 1938, is essentially unavailable to them. I do not know whether this is a loss. I think it is a change which is different, which is simply the ongoing alteration of what the world is and what it offers. What I know from sitting in this chair for this many years is that the human needs inside all of it, the need to be known, to be loved, to find work that matters, to make something, to be in community with others, to have a quiet hour now and then. Those needs are the same across every generation I have known. My grandchildren are trying to find them in different places and through different means than I did, and some of what they find is better than what I found, and some is different rather than better, but the seeking is the same. The seeking is what we all share, all of us across all the years and all the changes, trying to locate the things that matter and to hold them well. I want to say something about gratitude, though I am aware that old people who talk about gratitude often sound like they are performing a quality rather than actually feeling it. What I feel is not the performance. What I feel is specific and material. Gratitude for the particular life I had, which was not the only possible life, not the best possible life in some abstract sense, but my life, made of my specific people in my specific place, and for that specificity, which is the thing that makes a life rather than a category. I'm grateful for Harold, for the 39 years of his steadiness and his honesty and his laughter, which was specific and real, and which I can still hear when I think about it. I'm grateful for Catherine and Robert and Patricia, who are people I like, which is not automatic with children. Love is automatic, or as automatic as anything in this world, but liking is something they have to earn, and they have earned it, each in their own way. I am grateful for Susan, Robert's wife, who became my friend before she became my daughter-in-law, and who has never stopped being both. I am grateful for the hardware store and the grain elevator, and Mr. Bowden's history class, and Loretta Haynes's directness, and the library on Tuesday afternoons, and the symphony on the radio, and every single one of the ordinary days. I am grateful for being alive at 91, which is a specific and precarious grace that I receive with the humility it deserves. Not everyone gets to 91. Many of the people I have loved most did not get to 91. I am here and they are not, and I cannot explain that, and I have long since stopped trying to explain it. I am simply here, in this chair, with the lamp on and the quilt across my knees and the rain outside and a life behind me that was full, that was made of good things and hard things in the proportion that life generally offers, and I am tonight still glad to be in it. The library. I haven't spoken enough about the library, which was a mistake because the library was one of the most important places in my life for 8 decades. The Millbrook Public Library occupied, for most of the years I used it, a single room in the municipal building on Court Street, with a librarian named Mrs. Eleanor Pruitt, same first name, different person entirely, who ran it from 1948 to 1977, and who had the librarian's gift of knowing what a person needed to read next, a gift that is more mysterious and more valuable than most people understand. She would hand you a book across the counter, without comment, and you would take it home and read it, and discover that she had been right, that this was exactly what you needed, though you hadn't known you needed it, and hadn't asked. I've been a reader all my life in the specific way that people are readers who discovered early that books were the most efficient available vehicle for getting somewhere else. Not to escape. I want to be careful about that word because my life was not one I was trying to escape, but to supplement, to add dimensions to the life I was living, to spend time inside other people's experiences and other periods of time, and other ways of understanding the world. I read novels and history and biography and, as I got older, the books that tried to understand things, sociology, psychology, popular science, the kind of books that explain what researchers have found and what it might mean. I read Dr. Bowlby's work on attachment in the early 1980s, and I read it with the feeling of someone who is being told the true version of a story they were told wrong the first time. Loretta's dementia came on gradually, which is how it usually comes, not as a sudden event but as a slow alteration in the quality of the person. You know, small deviations at first that you explain away, and then larger ones that can't be explained away, and then the conversation in which you acknowledge together what is happening, which was perhaps the hardest conversation of my friendship with Loretta, harder than any we had had in 6 decades of telling each other the truth. Because this was a truth neither of us could do anything about. We could not fix it by being honest about it. We could only be honest about it, and hold what we knew together, which we did. And then she was gone in the incremental way that dementia takes a person, and then she was entirely gone, and the going had taken long enough that the grief was intermixed with a complicated relief that I felt guilty about feeling, and that I now understand was appropriate. The things I know now that I did not know at 50, at 60, that I have learned in the specific laboratory of living into my 80s and 90s, that the body's intelligence is worth respecting, and that this does not conflict with the doctor's intelligence, that both are sources and neither is complete, that most of the things I worried about did not happen, that most of the things that did happen were manageable, even the ones I was certain would not be, that the people I loved were better at managing difficulty than I gave them credit for, including my children when they were young, and my grandchildren when they encountered their adult hardships. That what I had to offer them was not solutions, I rarely had solutions, but the specific quality of being someone who knew them and who was still there. Sleep is different at 91 than it was at 30 or 40. Sleep at 30 or 40 was something you did because your body required it, something you fit around the requirements of the day, something that occasionally eluded you when the worries were large and the children were ill or the accounts were not balancing. Sleep now is something I approach with a kind of respect, a recognition that it is not a small thing, but a large and important thing, that the night is where the body does its deepest work, that the rest is not a pause in the life but a part of the life, the part where the integration happens, where the day's material is sorted and filed and the self is restored to itself. I am better at sleep now than I was at 40. This is one of the compensations of being old. The things I do not regret are the things I did out of love, even when they were not advised, not reasonable, not efficient. I do not regret picking Catherine up at 2 a.m. when she was crying and the schedule said to wait. I do not regret the Sunday I drove to Cincinnati when Robert called, and his voice told me something was wrong, even though what was wrong turned out to be a marriage difficulty that he needed to talk about rather than something I could help with practically, because being there was the help, and being there was what I had to offer. I do not regret the hours I spent with my mother in her last years driving her to the appointments, and sitting with her through the long afternoons that she could not fill with the activities she had always used to fill them. I do not regret being present. I have never regretted being present. The question that people ask old people, the ones who are genuinely asking, not just making conversation, is usually some version of what do you know now that you wish you had known then. I have been asked this enough times to have refined my answer, and my answer is this. I wish I had been less afraid of my own knowledge. I had a great deal of knowledge in the years when I was young and uncertain that I did not trust because I had been told in many forms that it was not the kind of knowledge that counted, that it was sentiment or instinct or feeling rather than the real reliable professional expertise that came from books and training. I wish I had understood earlier that my knowledge was knowledge, that watching my child with the attention of a person who has done nothing else for 3 years produces a data set, that my mother's experience of running a household through the Depression was a form of economic expertise, that what we know from doing and caring is not less than what we know from studying. It is different. Both are necessary. Neither alone is sufficient. I want to tell you what tonight looks like from here. Not a past evening, not a remembered one, but this one. This specific evening, this October rain, and this amber lamp and this whole house quiet around me in the way that a house organizes itself around a single person, one pair of footsteps, one rhythm of being. I have been in this house for many years now. It knows me, I know it. We have arrived at a mutual accommodation that I find restful, the way any long-established arrangement eventually becomes restful once all the negotiations are complete. The room is small and contains things I chose. That is a pleasure of advanced age that I did not anticipate. The rooms are finally entirely mine. Organised by no preferences but my own, undisturbed by the constant negotiation of 2 people living together, the compromises that are small and daily and continuous, and that constitute over decades a significant portion of what a shared life is. The armchair is where I want the armchair, the lamp is where I want the lamp, the books are on the shelves in the order I keep them, which is not alphabetical and not by subject but by some interior logic of association that makes sense to me, and that I have never needed to explain to anyone. This is a very great luxury. Most people do not understand it as a luxury until they have it. My daughter Catherine called this afternoon, which is a Tuesday call, reliable as the bread used to be on Mondays and Thursdays. She lives 40 minutes away now. She moved back to this part of Ohio when her own children were grown, which I receive as a gift without saying so too directly, because she didn't do it for me, she did it for herself and her husband, and I was simply the fortunate proximity. She called to tell me about her oldest granddaughter's birthday, which happened last weekend, which means I have a great-great-grandchild who has had another birthday, which means that the line extends from that farmhouse in 1931 to a birthday party in 2024 in a way that is mathematically straightforward and emotionally impossible to fully comprehend. I've been thinking tonight, as I've been thinking in one form or another all evening, telling you this long, meandering story of a life, about the years when my children were small and the pediatricians told us things that were wrong, and what it cost, and what it didn't cost, and how you hold both of those truths at once. I am not bitter about it. I want to be clear about that, because bitterness would be the easy thing and the useless thing, the thing that would warm you briefly and then leave you colder than you started. I am not bitter. I am clear. What those years asked of young mothers, the 1950s, the early 60s, the era of the schedule and the injunction not to spoil, and the warm professional certainty of men who had not raised children about how children should be raised, was to become strangers to their own knowing, to learn to read authority over instinct, science over sensation, the schedule over the child in front of them who was asking for something the schedule did not account for. I did this. I was not alone in doing it. The women I knew, my mother's generation and my own, most of us did this, because the culture left very little room for doing otherwise. Without being labelled difficult or uneducated or over-emotional, we were not over-emotional. We were right, and we were told we were wrong, and we believed it, which is the most costly part. I'm glad to be alive in a time when the conversation has changed, when the research has caught up to what the bodies of mothers knew and said, plainly to anyone willing to listen, when young women are encouraged, at least sometimes, to trust what they know alongside what they are told. The change came too late for my own early years as a mother, but it did not come too late for my daughters and daughters-in-law, and it has not come too late for my granddaughters, and that is not nothing. That is in fact something significant. The possibility that each generation will be less systematically separated from its own knowing than the one before it. The rain outside has softened to something barely there, the way rain sounds at the very end when it's deciding whether to stop. The lamp makes its circle. On the shelf across from me is the photograph of Harold and me at our 25th anniversary, 1976, which someone took at the party his brother threw for us. We are standing in the backyard of the house on Maple Street, and Harold has his arm around me, and we are both laughing at something just outside the frame. I do not remember what we were laughing at, it doesn't matter. What I see in the photograph is two people who are genuinely glad to be standing there together, in that yard, in that summer, at that point in their life. That is a true thing about that moment, the camera found it. Beside the photograph is the biscuit tin. Not my mother's biscuit tin, which passed from the kitchen on Route 12 to one of Thomas's daughters when the house was cleared, but a tin I found at an estate sale many years ago that is the same shape and approximately the same colour, and that serves the same purpose. I keep letters in it. Harold's letters from the early years of our marriage, when he travelled occasionally for the hardware business, and wrote to me from Dayton and Columbus and once from Cincinnati. My mother's letters to me from the 70s when I was living in Millbrook, and she was still on Route 12, and we were close enough to visit but still far enough to write. Thomas's letters from before he died, long rambling letters about the farm and the weather and the grandchildren, the same subject matter as my father's farm paper read aloud, the same steady attention to the particular and the local that I recognise as the family voice. The quilt across my knees was made by my mother from flour sacks. Some of them are the blue and white checked cotton that I remember from my blouses in grade school, pieces of the same fabric that I wore as a child now keeping me warm at 91. She made things to last. She was that kind of woman, the kind who thought about the future use of things, about who would have them next and what condition they would need to be in. The quilt has been with me since she died. It is worn soft in the way that things get worn soft over decades of use and washing, the way the best things become eventually, not worn out but worn in, shaped by the using. I think about the girl on Route 12, the one who walked to school in January with the cold air hitting her and her breath making its little cloud. I think about her standing in the parlour when the symphony came through the radio and feeling something enormous walk through the room. I would not want to reach back and change her path. I am too much the product of that path. I am made of exactly those steps, and to change them would be to unmake me in ways I am not willing to consider. But I would want her to know some things, if I could somehow arrange for her to know them. I would want her to know that the instincts are real and should be trusted, that the knowledge in her body is a form of knowledge, that the authorities who tell her otherwise are not evil but are limited, and that being limited is different from being right, and that she is permitted to hold both truths at once, to respect the authority and to maintain her own knowing, without this being contradiction. I would want her to know that the library books and the radio symphony and the afternoons with Loretta along the creek are not preliminary to the life but are the life, happening at its most essential frequency, that she will be a good enough mother even when she doubts it, and that good enough is what good actually looks like from the inside, and that the perfect version visible from the outside is mostly invented. I would want her to know that Harold is coming, not the specific name, not the specific person. She hasn't met him yet in that winter of the radio symphony. But the fact that someone is coming who will be worth the waiting, who will be honest and kind and steady in the specific way she needs, who will hold her hand in a hospital room 39 years into the future without knowing that is what he is signing up for, but who will do it anyway, because that is who he will turn out to be. I would want her to know that, to know. And I would want her to know that she will be here someday, in a chair with a lamp on, 91 years old, with the rain outside and the quilt across her knees, and a life that has been almost entirely lived, and that is, from this distance, exactly what a life should be. Full of the people you loved and the things that mattered and the ordinary days that were the actual substance of it, the days that looked like nothing and were everything. It is late. The lamp is steady. The rain may stop tonight or continue until morning, and either way the morning will come and I will be here for it, which is still, at 91, still after everything, a gift that I receive as one. Sleep well, dear. You have listened a long time tonight, and I am grateful for the company. I have been talking to you the way my mother talked to me, the way the best conversations go, not because there is something particular to report, but because another person's presence, even quiet, even sleeping, is a kind of warmth that the solitary life cannot quite replicate. You have been that warmth tonight. I hope I have been something of it to you. I've been sitting here for a long time tonight, telling you this story, and I am aware that the story is not a story in the usual sense. It does not have a plot, not in the way that plots are arranged, with rising action, and crisis, and resolution. A life is not arranged that way. A life is more like a long and winding piece of music where the themes come back differently, where something you heard in the first movement appears again in the third, transformed by everything that has come between, where the ending, when it comes, does not resolve so much as it arrives, naturally as the music arrives at the place where it was always going. The cameo at my neck, let me tell you about the cameo, because I have worn it so long that I sometimes forget to tell people its story. It belonged to my grandmother Weiss, who brought it from Bavaria when she came to Ohio in 1892, a young woman of 17 travelling alone on a ship across the Atlantic, which requires a kind of courage that I cannot quite locate in my own 18-year-old self, and cannot imagine in someone younger still. She wore it on her wedding day in Ohio in 1894, and on her own daughter's wedding day, my mother's in 1920, and on my mother's daughter's wedding day, which was mine, in 1951. It is ivory and gold, a woman's profile carved in the ivory, and it is worn slightly from being handled and from being worn, and the wearing has not damaged it, but has made it more completely itself, the way things become more completely themselves when they have been used well for a long time. I think about the grandmother who brought it across the Atlantic. She did not have an easy life in Ohio. She lost 2 children before I was born, which was not uncommon then, but was nonetheless her loss, her specific grief. And she made do, to use my mother's phrase, in all the ways that immigrants of that era made do, which is to say by working harder than they had worked in the country they came from, and by putting down roots as deep as they could go in the new soil, and by becoming, over time, people whose children and grandchildren did not remember any other country. I am the grandchild who did not remember Bavaria. I am fully and completely from Ohio, from that county road, and that creek, and that kitchen, and the cameo is the only material thread connecting me to the woman who came before my grandmother, who was the woman who started this particular American version of the line. The framing open of this evening, if I were to give tonight a title, would be something like The Value of Ordinary Presence. What I have been trying to say, in all the different ways I've tried to say it, the seasons on the farm, the Depression years, the war years, the young children and the pediatricians and the hardware store and the loss, is that the value of a life is not located in its exceptional moments, its high points, its milestones. It is located in the texture of the ordinary, in the quality of attention brought to the daily, in the kindness and the honesty and the steadiness of the everyday. Harold in his chair, my mother's bread on Mondays, the girls at the creek in July. These are the things that a life is made of. Everything else is the occasion. The ordinary is the substance. My children have heard some version of this from me. probably more often than they needed to, the way old people repeat things they believe important, and the people who love them receive the repetition with varying degrees of patience. Catherine receives it with patience and occasional impatience, which is very Catherine. Robert receives it with the slight abstraction of a man who is busy thinking about something else, and who is still listening with part of his attention, which is very Robert. Patricia receives it with the quality of someone who has been thinking about the same thing independently, and is glad to find another person who has arrived at the same place, which is very Patricia, and which I find, of all the responses, the most sustaining. What I want for the people listening to me tonight, the people in their rooms, wherever they are in the world, is this: that you find the ordinary of your own life, that you locate the specific texture of your particular days, and that you give it your attention, not in a self-conscious way, not with the performance of mindfulness, but with the real and simple practice of being where you are. The Tuesday afternoon, the kitchen window, the sound your house makes in rain, the person beside you or the person you remember, the quality of the night. These things are what there is, and they are enough. And from the distance of 91 years I can tell you that they are more than enough. They are in fact the whole of it, the whole beautiful ordinary whole of it, and it goes by faster than you think and slower than it feels, and it is worth your full attention. The rain has been on and off all evening. It is off again now, or so nearly off that the difference is only academic. The house is very quiet. My breathing has slowed in the way that breathing slows when a long evening reaches its end. I am tired in the good way, the way you are tired when you have said something that needed saying and have been listened to, when the evening has been used for what evenings are for, which is the slow settling of the self into the rest of it, the quiet after the activity, the restoration of what the day uses up. You're doing the same thing wherever you are. Your breathing is slowing too. The day is putting itself away. There is a light on somewhere in the neighbourhood. I can see it from where I sit. A bedroom window 2 houses down. The bluish light of a television in a dark room. Someone awake at this hour for whatever reason keeps them awake, watching something or trying to sleep through the sound of it. I have been that person in other years. I have been awake at every hour the night contains, and I know all of them from the inside. The 2 o'clock dark, which is the heaviest. The 4 o'clock, which has a particular quality of being both very late and almost early. The 5:30 grey that is neither night nor morning. I have sat in all of those hours, and I am here now, on the other side of all of them, in the good lamplit side of the evening before sleep comes and takes you somewhere else. Let sleep come when it comes. Don't hurry it. Let the evening do its work of settling you. You are safe. Whatever needed to happen today has happened or has not happened and will wait for tomorrow. The night is large and it is yours, and there is no requirement in it. Just this. Just the breath, in and out. Just the warmth and the quiet and the long, good, ordinary gift of another night alive in the world. Sleep well, dear. If you find yourself back here some evening when the night feels long, I will be glad to have you. I put a new evening together each week, a different chapter, a different season, a different part of a life, and you are always welcome. Sleep well, dear. Come back whenever the night feels long. The rain has gone very quiet now, just a presence more than a sound, a dampness in the air, the sense of the world outside being washed and still. The lamp is on, the house is warm, there is nothing that needs to happen between now and morning, nothing is required of you. You're here, in whatever room you're in whatever night you're in, and that is sufficient. That is more than sufficient. That is a complete thing. If you're asleep already, then this is only the continuation of whatever you are dreaming, and you don't need to pay it any mind. If you are still awake, that is all right too. The night is long, and sleep comes in its own time and can't be forced. You know that. Just stay here. Just let your breathing slow the way it wants to slow when there is nothing pressing on it. I've been in this chair for a long time tonight, talking to you, telling you about a farmhouse in Ohio and a flour sack quilt and a biscuit tin full of letters, about the cold air of a January morning and the way a radio symphony moves through a room, about the children and the hard years and the beautiful ordinary days that were the life, the actual substance of it, not what happened around the life, but the life itself. I hope it has been something like what I hoped it would be, good company for a quiet hour. The way it's good to have someone in the room with you who does not need anything from you and who does not mind the dark. The night outside is very still now. The oak tree in the backyard is just a shape against the sky. the particular shape it has been in all the years I've known it, the one you recognize without thinking because it is so familiar it has become part of your idea of what a night looks like. There is a cardinal somewhere in the forsythia, probably, roosted for the night, a small warm weight of red in among the branches, asleep the way birds sleep, which is completely and all at once, the way they do everything. You can sleep the way the cardinal sleeps, all at once, completely. The lamp is making its circle. Inside the circle it is amber and warm, and I am here with my quilt and my biscuit tin, and my grandmother's cameo at my neck, and the long good weight of a life lived mostly right, mostly honestly, with the people I loved, and the work I was given, and the ordinary days that were everything. Outside the circle is the soft dark and the quiet house, and the night that has settled in for good now, for the whole long rest of it until morning. Let the night settle around you the same way. Let it be as large as it is without needing to be smaller. Let the thoughts that are still moving slow themselves and find their way to the edges, where they can be there without being urgent, where they can wait until morning when there will be time and light for them. There is always time. That is one thing a long life teaches you. Not in the panicked sense, not that you have enough time for everything, but in the quieter sense. This moment is sufficient. This breath is sufficient. The morning will come with its own requirements, and in the meantime there is this, just this, the dark and the warmth and the slowing of everything toward rest. Rest now. Rest in whatever room you're in. Rest in whatever night of your life you find yourself. Rest knowing that all the worries can wait. They are reliably patient, worries are. They will be exactly where you left them in the morning, and that this hour that is just for sleeping, is yours completely. No one is asking anything of you in this hour, not the past, not the future, just this. The house is breathing. The rain has stopped, or the rain is still there. Barely. I can't tell any more, which means it is very nearly stopped. The world outside is wet and dark and still, the streets empty, the fields empty, the same Ohio sky I have known for 91 years above it all, enormous and indifferent and somehow, tonight, simply companionable, simply there. I'm still here. I will be here as long as you need. If you'd like, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what the night is like there. I do wonder about that. The diversity of nights a person could be having while I sit here in mine. The city nights and the country nights, the summer ones and the winter ones, the ones where it is very late and the ones where it is early, the ones where you are alone and the ones where someone is asleep beside you. I wonder about all of them, and if there's a part of a life you'd like to hear about next, a year I haven't gotten to, a question about something I've mentioned, a decade you'd like me to stay in longer, leave it for me. I'll be here again next week, with the lamp on, with more to say. Sleep well. Sleep long and deep and dreamlessly if that is what you need, or dream something gentle and strange if that is what comes. Either way, when morning arrives, you will have rested, and that is the whole point of the night. Good night, dear. Good night.